Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 369. It's the end of September and therefore this is the Patreon Drydock, and at the time that you're listening to this, if all has gone well, I will have just about recovered from jet lag in Japan, and if things haven't gone well, then everyone's doing a frantic search for a massive fireball from a Finnair flight over the Arctic Circle. Nonetheless, either way, you get a Drydock, so it's not all bad. Bjarki Hilmarson asks, what exactly was the role of the signalman, and what was it that your favourite signalman Seymour did so badly? So, from the context of the question, I'm going to assume you mean the leading signalman or the flag lieutenant, or however it is titled in the various navies, i.e. the main guy in charge of signals, because technically a signalman can just mean guy who hoists signals, at which point, well, job title is pretty much job description as well. So for an officer like Seymour, the sequence of events is obviously first the admiral has to give the orders, or if you're lower level, the captain or whatever. So the person in charge issues some orders. You now have to try and interpret those orders into something that can be signalled, because of course they're going to use all sorts of language and most of it might not actually be in the signal book. Now, sometimes it might be really easy. The admiral might say, I want to turn to port 30 degrees, in which case, well, turn to port 30 degrees, that is actually a signal that is in the signal book. Nice and easy. But on the other hand, it might be something like the admiral saying, I want to pursue the enemy, but that doesn't involve a course, bearing, or speed. So you might then have to quickly work out what course do you actually have to set and include the modifier to increase speed to full. And you might need to ask clarifying questions of the officer, like, well, if we increase speed to full, we're going to leave behind this or that ship. So do we want to match speed with those ships, or are we just going full pelt and risk leaving them behind? And when you say pursuit, do you mean we're plotting an interception course, i.e. bow straight to the enemy? Or are we trying to sail in parallel to them to bring more guns to bear? You have to ask these questions. Then you've got to select the appropriate signals to convey that information to the rest of the fleet. And ideally, this should be as short and concise as possible to avoid confusion. But obviously, at the same time, you don't want to be too short and concise, because that might also lead to confusion if something more complicated than a single course change or similar is trying to be sent. And then once you've selected your signals, you order them hoisted on the halyards. And once they've been hoisted, you then have to look for acknowledgement from various other ships in the formation. And when the order is actually ready to be executed, you have to order it to be hauled down. Now that's what you're doing on the ship itself, because obviously the hauling down is the order to execute in 99.999% of circumstances. But it does go a little bit beyond that as well. So, for example, if you are sailing in such a manner that all the ships are laid out in a half chevron, let's say to port, well, hoisting the signals on your starboard side is a bit pointless, because that's going to be blocked by the smoke and possibly even the superstructure of your ship from the point of view of all the other ships. But equally, if there's a prevailing amount of wind that's blowing funnel smoke and possibly gun smoke across your port side, then maybe you need to hoist from the starboard halyards, because theoretically you should be able to spot either side. It's just a little bit harder to spot the offside. But while the port side might be a little bit more directly in view, if it's obscured by large amounts of smoke, then obviously that's not a good thing. Another thing you've got to work out is, as the flag officer, you've got to actually make the various assignments for relaying flag orders. Because especially in World War I, but even before in the Age of Sail, simply because you've hoisted your flag signals doesn't mean everybody in the fleet can actually see them, either because something's in the way or because they're just too far away to make them out. And so you would have designated ships to repeat the orders. So a formation considerably further away from the flagship would look to the repeater ship rather than to the flagship for specific orders. At the Battle of Trafalgar, for instance, Nelson had frigates stationed to either side of his columns, specifically to repeat signals so that everybody understood what was going on. And particularly in the age of steam, it may be necessary to change which ship is repeating those orders depending on the situation at hand, as of course maneuvers may carry different formations in different directions, and thus what was previously an ideal relay ship may no longer be so. And where Seymour fails, for the most part, I mean there's a lot of different failures, but the three most common failures that you see with Seymour are: one, the signals he hoists are sometimes not at all clear. Now, occasionally that is at Beatty's behest. He wants to hoist engage the enemy more closely at one point, for example. But there are a number of signals which Seymour selects to reflect the intent that Beatty has given, which are very confusing and end up not accurately conveying what Beatty intended, either because they are just flat out unclear, or because they theoretically make sense, but he hasn't considered how that signal will be interpreted from the point of view of various other ships. The concentration on Blucher being a good example of this. Another element was that Seymour was very lax and sometimes completely negligent in actually hauling down said signals to order them to be executed, which is a cardinal and very basic mistake in a signalman's book. So, for example, 5th Battle Squadron continuing on and then getting shot up by the High Seas Fleet is an example of this, where, yes, he had hoisted the order to turn around and get out of Dodge, but he failed to actually order the 5th Battle Squadron to do so via the execution element of the signal process, and thus 5th Battle Squadron was left charging in towards the High Seas Fleet until essentially they took it on their own initiative and thought, well, whatever the flag orders technically say, Beatty probably doesn't want us to kill ourselves. And the other one of Seymour's big three faults was failure to manage the relay system. So, for example, again at Jutland, HMS Tiger at one point was in charge of relaying signals from Lion because Tiger was some distance from Lion and somewhat closer to 5th Battle Squadron. But after a series of manoeuvres, Tiger was actually further from 5th Battle Squadron than Lion was, and yet Beatty didn't allocate a newer, closer battle cruiser to take up the signal relay role. He just left that to Tiger, and, well, Tiger's signals were even less distinct to 5th Battle Squadron than Lion's were. Elite Corsair asks, how do you think other nations' existing battleships would have performed in place of Washington and South Dakota at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, assuming all commander decisions and the electrical failure are the same? For example, the Rodney, King George V, Bismarck, Latoria, Richelieu, Strasbourg. Seems it would be an interesting case study with one ship as the punching bag and another as the shooter. So for this, if we assume that we're magically hand-waving it, so it doesn't matter what ship, it doesn't matter their electoral distribution system, they're going to suffer exactly the same power failures as South Dakota, and similarly, regardless of the ship, we've still got Admiral Lee and his elite-trained gunnery crew aboard whatever is subbing in for USS Washington, then, let's start with South Dakota. Given that South Dakota is mostly hit by 8-inch shells and a handful of 14-inch shells, the only ship from that list that I can see particularly struggling would be a Dunkirk or Strasbourg, because they have the lightest protection, and it's possible that some of the shells might actually go through. For example, there's a hit which on the US damage report is labelled hit number 25, an 8-inch shell that hits just below the aft superstructure on the belt, and the description says the projectile pierced the shell, that's the outer shell of the ship, torpedo bulkhead number 2, and penetrated the 12.2-inch side armour to a depth of about 8 inches. Now, of course, that's after having slowed down going through the various bits it describes, and it's hitting 12.2-inch angled armour, so against Strasbourg's armour and very definitely Dunkirk's armour, that might have been a penetrating hit. Given that South Dakota isn't really able to contribute all that much to the fight generally, then the others, by dint of, well, they will also survive, are going to do at least as well. And I suspect, in actual fact, a good chunk of them might actually have done better. Now, of course, Rodney being included on this list probably wouldn't be in the battle anyway because it's a little bit slower than the others. But if we assume for the sake of argument, since you asked the question, that it is, I think the King George V, Bismarck and Littorio would do very fractionally better than South Dakota, purely on the basis that there were quite a number of hits on or near the waterline which punch through the outer shell and then either detonate on the shell or detonate on the armour plate. And obviously the ships that I just mentioned don't have that same kind of big void space. Even the Littorios with their spaced armour, it's full of concrete. So the small amount of flooding that South Dakota suffered as a result of shell penetration wouldn't happen to King George V, Bismarck and Littorio, or Richelieu for that matter, or even Rodney. But the reason I highlight King George V, Bismarck and Littorio is because effectively they're going to come out of it just with a little bit less flooding. Richelieu and Rodney, however, will perhaps have a fairly substantial improvement in outcome. And that's for two reasons, both to do with the fact they're all forward design ships. Now, of course, there's a hit to the aft barbette on South Dakota. And if you've got an all forward design, you can't take a hit to an aft barbette because you don't have an aft barbette. So that's going to be a little bit less damage control for someone to do later on. If you want to be stupidly nitpicky and probably wrong, you could point out all the various hits to the superstructure and say, well, that probably won't happen, especially with Rodney and partially with Richelieu, because their superstructures are further back, so they'd all miss. But let's face it, the Japanese gunners were probably aiming for the superstructure, so they'd just adjust their aim slightly. But if they're aiming kind of center of mass, the other reason Richelieu and Rodney might do somewhat better is because they, of course, being all forward ships, have their secondary battery concentrated right aft. And historically, South Dakota's secondaries weren't able to contribute all that much to the proceedings because the flames and the smoke from the hits that South Dakota had taken obstructed their view. The flames also didn't help with the main armament engaging, but that was also more power failure stuff. Whereas in Richelieu and Rodney's case, because their armament, the main battery is right forward and the secondary battery is right aft, hits to the superstructure, which may or may not start fires, will probably have slightly less effect on the guns at the extremities. So they might, particularly with their secondary guns, be able to contribute some return fire. Now, in place of Washington, things get mixed up a little bit because it comes down to radar. There will be some slight differences because, of course, some of the ships on this list have 8 guns, some have 9 guns, which is the same as Washington, and some have 10 guns, that being the King George V. But realistically, the number of guns and the number of shells you're pumping downrange is not going to change things all that much for the Kongos. All of the guns on all of those ships can penetrate Kirishima's armour. Yes, King George V having 10 guns and bigger bursting charges will probably do a little bit more damage to Kirishima a little bit faster than everybody else. Bismarck, although it only has 8 guns, if the loading systems don't break down, theoretically has a higher rate of fire. The Littorios have a slightly lower rate of fire, but I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference. What is going to make a big difference, though, is the various ships' radar capabilities, because this is, of course, a night fight. Now, all of the ships theoretically could engage at night using optical-only systems, but of course radar helps quite considerably. So the Littorios, or Littorio, Richelieu and Strasbourg would be at the bottom of the pile in that case, because they don't have any radar that can be usefully used for gunnery. Bismarck does have surface search radar, and of course can also use some of its radar systems for gunnery ranging, so that would theoretically put it in a similar ballpark to Washington, with the exception, of course, that as soon as she starts firing her guns, the radar's probably going to break, which is a mark against. And then King George V and Rodney, by late 1942, have surface search and gunnery radar aboard, so they will be able to present as good data to Admiral Lee as Washington historically was able to do. And depending on the ship and the position of their radar at that exact period, they might actually even present a slightly better picture, because, of course, Washington had a dead spot, which they lost South Dakota in for a while. So given the differences in radar coverage on the various ships, they might actually have an even better idea of what's going on. Seb Dove asks, if you're a floatplane pilot on a cruiser during the Second World War, what would your typical day-to-day life look like? And how did this change from navy to navy, theatre to theatre, and as the war went on? So this is probably a question that an aviation historian would have more knowledge on, but broadly speaking, from what I've read, most days a cruiser floatplane pilot didn't really do all that much other than a bit of training, a bit of theoretical study, obviously being on call whenever needed, and helping out with the maintenance and care of the aircraft, because as with almost anything to do with war at sea, most of the time there isn't a huge amount to actually do other than your regular duties. However, in terms of when you actually had to fly the aircraft, again, from what I've been able to gather, in the early part of the war, at least from an Allied perspective, the majority of your flights would be either anti-submarine patrol or search for enemy ships, especially if you're hunting for something like the Graf Spee, or if you're in combat, the occasional bit of live combat spotting. So, for example, aircraft at the Battle of the River Plate from the British cruisers were used to spot the fall of shot. The usage of floatplanes on cruisers in general dies off quite a bit during the middle part of the war. So in that time period, if you're on the Allied side, then escort carriers and so forth are taking over the anti-submarine role. Radar is taking over the closer range search and the gunnery role for spotting the fall of shot. So realistically, most floatplanes at that stage are only being used for more long-distance recon. But then once you get to the end of World War II, assuming the cruiser in question still has the floatplane, there's now a sudden uptick in demand for the floatplane services, particularly because there's a lot of shore bombardment going on. So again, spotting the fall of shot, except this time for bombardment against land targets, and recovery of pilots who have ditched their aircraft. Both in the search and rescue terms were roles that the pilots picked up at that point. Primark 359 asks, could you tell us more about the Operation Sea Lion academic wargame that was played in the Cold War that you mentioned in Drydock 336? I know this could probably be a Wednesday video. Yeah, it will be at some point. But could you go over the highlights for those of us who are not well aware of it? So this was done at Sandhurst in the early to mid-1970s. I think it was 1974. And although obviously they were doing their best, there were a few changes or assumptions made in the setup of the scenario. For instance, it was posited that instead of switching to attacks on London primarily, starting the Blitz, the Luftwaffe would instead continue attacking 11 groups airfields in the southeast, which would give the Germans the idea that they had air supremacy. In actual fact, they didn't have air supremacy, even in the war game, but they thought they did, which was obviously one of the key triggers to actually launching Operation Sea Lion. Because this was the 1970s, there were also a few other things which they assumed in good faith, but as we know now, were somewhat inaccurate. So they made a slightly weirdly both over and under optimistic assessment of the German invasion force, which basically they said, okay, it's a bunch of river barges and some tugs. Now, what we know now, because they hadn't managed to dig up all the archival research at that point, was that the German invasion fleet involved considerably more vessels and considerably more types of vessels. But at the same time, we also know that there were considerable weaknesses compared to what they had assumed, like the fact that a good chunk of the German invasion force was actually unpowered and would need to be towed. They also changed a few things which were frankly suicidal about the original German plan, like bringing over almost everything they could in the first wave, but then just sitting with a bunch of stuff offshore waiting to be unloaded over the subsequent days after the first wave went in, which of course would have left those ships sitting ducks for resistance. Also because at this point, ultra intelligence wasn't known about publicly, the war game assumed that the Royal Navy would sail its fleet, although it did assume that the fleet would sail out of the various plans the Royal Navy had, but they assumed that it would sail their fleet down from Scotland once the invasion started, whereas nowadays we know that ultra intelligence almost certainly would have given a heads up of when the invasion was about to start, which would have let the fleet sail earlier. And it assumed, for whatever reason, that the various heavy artillery emplacements on and around Dover would have no effect on the incoming German invasion. Now, due to some of this, it meant that when the Germans did actually launch their invasion in a break in the weather in the war game, there wasn't all that much to oppose them in terms of naval assets, and so they managed to get their first wave ashore. But even so, the invasion was contained relatively quickly by the various British troops that had obviously been set in place specifically to guard against this. And then when the second and third echelons were launched, because obviously they changed that from just sitting off the beaches, well, due to the delay, the Royal Navy was late showing up. But when they showed up, oh boy, did they show up like the fist of an angry god. Over 75 full-scale warships piled into the channel and smashed straight into the follow-up invasion forces and shockingly steamrolled them. And then, well, cut off from supply and most reinforcements, the German beachheads were evacuated as best they could, and most remaining German troops were then forced to surrender before the end of September was out. The home fleet was made ready to sail, so you could have had battleships ploughing in as well, but as it turns out, they weren't actually needed to deploy. The Germans ended up suffering something like an 80% casualty rate for all of the troops that they deployed. So, I mean, with all the caveats we mentioned earlier, essentially the latter part of the exercise, I would say, is fairly realistic and essentially reflects what at least I think, and I think most historians I've spoken to think probably would have happened, except with the first echelon, because once the Royal Navy gets word of what's about to happen, which obviously in the war game they didn't know about Ultra, but in reality they would have done, essentially I think what would have happened is you would have seen that massive rolling steel fist of the Royal Navy hammer down the channel, except it would have happened during the first echelon, and the Germans probably wouldn't have gotten ashore except in a few broken dribs and drabs. Volunteer per Order O'Sullivan asks, why was the Royal Naval Air Service responsible for the air defence of the United Kingdom until 1916? It seems especially odd when one considers that coastal fortifications were manned by the army, the artillery and the engineers. Well, it was actually relatively simple. The army was charged as being the offensive arm of the British armed forces, and some people in the Navy would maintain it has actually managed to keep that role. The Navy, however, was charged with the defence of the United Kingdom and the Empire generally. Essentially, the thinking was, well, we spend the majority of our money on the Navy, we are an island, we're surrounded by water, therefore the single best chance of stopping the enemy, if they tried to invade us, is at sea. And if all that massive investment in battleships, cruisers, destroyers, etc. can't stop the enemy, given that the UK has a relatively small army, then if they can manage to conduct a relatively large landing, we're probably not stopping them with the army anyway. But forts and so forth would be able to, hold specific areas until the Navy could get there to drive off the attackers. So since the Navy is the one that's charged with defending the UK, the Royal Naval Air Service then took on the role of air defence of the UK, because the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Army's air force, was over in France supporting the Army in the directly offensive role against the Germans. The other fact, of course, was that for their own interest, the Royal Navy had set up a whole series of air bases and air stations for both fighters and patrol aircraft and seaplanes all around the UK coast, which was exactly where you'd want to have air bases to take on Zeppelins and German aircraft that were coming across the Channel and the North Sea. And so they not only had the resources, but they also had the bases, and they had the doctrinal role of defending the UK, which extended to UK airspace. Of course, as time went on and the need for an independent air force became clearer and clearer, and the German aircraft and Zeppelins began performing better and better, which meant you needed specialized fast climbing, high altitude fighters, then things started to shift a little bit away from that. But for the first half of World War I, it made perfect sense for the Royal Naval Air Service to be part of the defence of the UK. Vokir asks, is there any recorded information on how World War I and II disrupted fishing operations in contested waters? Were there expectations for ships, aircraft and submarines to sink or seize enemy fishing vessels if they came across them? Broadly speaking, there was a fair amount of disruption, and yes, a good chunk of that is recorded. So at the, if you like, port end of things, two major forms of disruption were, one, obviously fishing trawler crews tend to be fairly experienced sailors, and so they were prime targets for recruitment and later conscription of men into particularly the wartime navies. Now, depending on the nation, sometimes because of their role in feeding the nation, trawlermen could be given a protected occupation status, but one, that didn't prevent trawlermen from just signing up to do their bit in the war anyway and, joining various navies and volunteer reserves. And two, sometimes that protection was a little late in coming or only applied to certain elements of a trawler's crew. And then you have the other issue, which is that the trawlers themselves very often were taken up, not in a whole, but certainly part of the trawler fleets were very often taken up to do things like anti-submarine work in World War I, mine laying, minesweeping, managing anti-submarine defences like nets, and various other defences. Now, of course, the admiralties of various nations did also build trawler-based hulls for their own purposes, but at the beginning of each war, there was a certain uptake in the actual trawler hulls themselves, so that would diminish the trawler fleets. Then you would have operational areas where fishing was banned by various nations, mainly just to clear the area for military operations, so that would affect how much fish the trawlers could bring in, what kinds of fish, etc., etc. And then, after all that, you do also have enemy action. Now, trawlers, broadly speaking, weren't actually priority targets. There tended to be an unwritten understanding, at least most of the time, that if one side started picking off the trawlers of the other side, well, then the other side could retaliate and then both sides would lose, because trawlers ultimately were concerned with feeding the populace. And right up until you got into things like starvation blockades, that wasn't seen as something that was worth targeting or moral to target. And also, ultimately, most trawlers are pretty small, and there tend to be quite a lot of them in that period. So you could spend an awful lot of time in ammunition taking out a relatively small number of fishing ships, when there would be much more impressive and important targets to go after that would be carrying things like munitions. And that's why you get, for example, in World War I, the Germans are in part worried that the reason that they constantly get intercepted when they're deploying on various missions, because they obviously don't know about Room 40 and the decoding efforts, is they think that the various trawler fishing fleets, which kind of watch things go by, are radioing in the positions and sailing times of their fleets. So they do conduct some sweeps to try and disrupt or get rid of those trawler fleets. They're wrong, of course. It doesn't actually make any difference, but it shows that up until that point, up until they thought they had a very specific military reason for dealing with things, they generally were leaving most of the trawlers alone. And even in things like the closing stages of World War II, the British and American submarines, surface ships, and aircraft that are going after Japanese shipping are still primarily looking for big, deep ocean freighters and other merchant ships, and essentially small coastal fishing craft are targets of last resort when there's literally nothing else worth shooting at. Farenda Ritter asks, the East India Company ship Nemesis was quoted at the time to have a letter of marque from the Admiralty. Was this truly the case? What's the story behind the East India Company building Nemesis, either with Royal Navy approval or tacit approval? Were there tax breaks, a quid pro quo from the government to the company for doing it, and what did the Royal Navy think of its combat performance? Going in roughly reverse order, the Royal Navy was actually quite impressed with Nemesis's combat performance, in part because she was able to operate in very shallow waters that with a normal wooden warship, you ran a good risk of going aground and then severely damaging the hull. Nemesis did hit quite a lot of rocks and various other things, but thanks to her iron hull, she just ended up with a bunch of dents instead, which obviously was a lot better than having chunks ripped off if you had a wooden ship. The other thing they were quite impressed by was, although they didn't know it at the time, because Nemesis was operating in warm waters and a very hot environment generally, what shot did hit her iron plating, if it went through, tended to just punch a small hole, roughly the size of the shot, and that was pretty much it. So there was very minimal splintering, if any. And this was quite encouraging, obviously, compared to wooden warships, which, when they took a hit, had lots of splinters flying off all over the place. As I said, what they didn't realize at the time was that this was because the iron in the warm environment off China was quite ductile, whereas they later found when they tried to build a bunch of iron ships of their own that if you used that same kind of iron, the blend that was being produced at the time, it became very brittle and actually made even more splinters than the wood did in colder waters. Now, as far as were there tax breaks or quid pro quos or Royal Navy involvement, not really. The East India Company was not just building Nemesis, it was building a whole fleet of Nemesis and her sister ships. And honestly, you've got to remember, the East India Company was incredibly powerful at this point. You know, fictional mega corporations in cyberpunk dystopias have nothing on the East India Company. The East India Company had its own navy, its own merchant fleet, its own army, massive wealth. And as I've pointed out a few other times on the channel, when people go on about, oh, the British Empire occupied India, no, actually, for the most part, the Indian subcontinent was conquered by a private company. Yes, there was occasional British military involvement, but the vast majority of India's takeover and the subsequent setup of the Raj was done by the East India Company pretty much off their own bat and on their own dime, or penny, I suppose. So when you're talking about a private corporation with the power to take over a good chunk of the planet's surface, them fitting out a new and innovative sort of warship isn't exactly surprising. Now, as far as whether or not Nemesis had a letter of marque, I don't actually think she did. It's reported in some books, and you'll find a quote on the Wikipedia article as well, but that appears to be a misunderstanding in the books, because for a change, if the Wikipedia article is actually fairly well put together for that particular section, because it's a quote from the Times, and because the Nemesis and her sisters were being built secretly, Nemesis wasn't listed on the fleet list of the Honourable East India Company. And therefore the Times made the assumption that she was an opium smuggling vessel operating under a letter of marque from the Admiralty. But the fact was, the reason that Nemesis wasn't on the East India Company fleet list wasn't because she was some special collusion with the Admiralty. It was simply that the committee that in question within the East India Company wanted to keep her off the books so that people wouldn't realise what they were up to. Because one of the things you've got to bear in mind is a letter of marque, technically speaking a letter of marque and reprisal, is issued by a government to allow a private entity to conduct war or warlike activities against a specific opponent that the government is at war with. The government wasn't at war with China, so they couldn't have issued a letter of marque and reprisal to Nemesis to operate against the Chinese, because there was no war under which that would have any purview. Now, of course, that would develop into the Opium Wars, but at the time that Nemesis sailed, there's no grounds for her to have a letter of marque. And in fact, if you go back through newspapers of the time which report parliamentary proceedings, the government officials who were in charge of such things actually, when questioned, and actually, ironically enough, in one of them, the verbatim transcript literally says, "I read in a newspaper that Nemesis has a letter of marque. Are you going to issue more?" Presumably because there were other people who wanted to fit out ships to go and shoot up the Chinese for fun and profit. The government turned around and said, no, Nemesis is a private vessel built for the East India Company, and essentially whatever she's doing out there, she's doing on her own bat. She doesn't have a letter of marque. Glenn Ricafrente asks, I've seen numerous references to how the Kido Butai and the Japanese Navy in general cut their teeth during the Sino-Japanese War in the late 30s, which was partly why they were such a formidable force in the first months of the Pacific War. Can you tell us what they did and how they honed their skills in that war? So, relatively briefly speaking, the Japanese Navy primarily conducted air operations in support of various efforts in China. Partly, this was because, well, yes, the Japanese army did have its own air force, but it was an ongoing offensive, so in the early stages, the Japanese didn't control land-based airfields in China, and even once they'd taken a fair chunk of the Chinese coast, obviously as offensives continued, they would be going into areas where they were out of distance of occupied Chinese airfields or Chinese airfields that they'd built. Some parts of China just weren't particularly suitable for the construction of airfields, and in other parts they didn't have enough control. So they might have theoretical control over an area, but not enough of a tight control over an area to risk building something like an airfield with lots of valuable aircraft on it that partisans or rapid troop attacks might then get in and destroy those aircraft. And of course, when fresh landings are going on, again, you're not going to have any direct air support from land-based airfields, so the Navy comes in clutch once more. Plus, of course, the Navy has its own long-range bombers and so forth. They can launch from nearby areas that they've already occupied, islands and so forth. And so what this meant was that the Japanese had experience in supporting and conducting amphibious operations, and because obviously both the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists had air forces of their own, plus volunteer units like the Flying Tigers, it meant that Japanese pilots saw a reasonable amount of air combat. So their bomber pilots got experience in how to do bombing missions, what not to do in bombing missions, how to act under enemy fire, what attack profiles led to the most accurate hits and things like this. And the fighter pilots, of course, got to experience live air-to-air combat. So again, what to do, what not to do, how to develop tactics to deal with enemy aircraft. And obviously, given that the USAAF had the P-40 and related aircraft as its primary fighters in the early days, the fact that there were a number of that generation P-39, P-40 aircraft in China meant they had direct experience of what peer opposition looked like, and of course they could then start adapting aircraft designs and tactics to help counter that. They obviously didn't encounter Wildcats because they weren't in service at that point, but it did give them a reasonable idea of what it would be like fighting American pilots. But as anyone who's been in the military will most likely tell you, a good chunk of what you learn in the first few sections of combat that you face is what not to do and how to react. And while that might seem fairly simple, that will actually keep you alive a huge amount of the time, assuming that you survive making those first mistakes. And with the best will in the world, fighting the Chinese Communist and Nationalist forces was, compared to fighting the entire military might of the US Navy, was comparatively speaking easy mode. So a good number of Japanese pilots would be able to make mistakes that perhaps against a well-trained US Navy carrier group would get them killed, but were perhaps recoverable in some circumstances against Chinese forces. And once they recovered and learned not to make that mistake again, well, then when they went up against US forces, they were much deadlier. Nick Brodar asks, given the difficulties the Japanese experienced invading Wake Island, had Admiral Pye not recalled Task Force 14, could the US have held Wake? Conversely, should they have even attempted to contest it? And therefore, should Task Force 14 instead have tried to evacuate the garrison? Task Force 14, of course, centered around USS Saratoga. Should they have attempted to contest Wake? Yes, in the grand scheme of things, they should have, because one, you don't just hand over random bits of your territory to an opponent without a fight unless there is an extremely good reason to do so. Basically, if there is a chance of resistance where either there's a chance of repelling the enemy invasion or there's a chance of doing a significant amount of damage disproportionate to your own losses without somehow otherwise imperiling your own interests, then basic military strategy and national honor dictates that you should do so. And obviously, as it turned out, the defenders of Wake Island were able to do a considerable amount of damage considering what equipment they had to hand. Of course, there will be circumstances where it's very clear that overwhelming force is going to be applied to you, and resistance would cause, say, for example, needless civilian suffering, and they are presumably your own civilians. So in those cases, perhaps handing an outer environ over without a fight could be justified, but for something like Wake, that doesn't apply. Now, going to the first half, could the US have held Wake Island if Task Force 14 had continued onwards? It very much depends, because as it turns out, the Japanese had a couple of carriers with escorts present as Task Force 14 was closing in, and that was the main reason why it was held back. So a lot of could the US have held Wake would depend on how that encounter went down. If the Japanese detected Task Force 14 coming in before the Saratoga was made aware that there were Japanese carriers out there, or if she knew that there were Japanese carriers out there somewhere but didn't know where they were, then obviously the Japanese carriers could have launched a strike to take out Saratoga. And to be honest, 2 Japanese fleet carriers versus Saratoga, where the Japanese carriers have gotten their strike off and Saratoga doesn't know where to reply, that's not ending well for the US carrier. So the US could have just ended up being down Saratoga and possibly some of her escorts, and Wake still falls. In fact, the morale impact of having Saratoga and her group destroyed on the way in might have caused Wake to fall even earlier. The flip side to that at the other extreme is, of course, that Saratoga or some part of her group somehow discovers the Japanese carriers when they don't know that Saratoga's on her way, and Saratoga gets the Alpha strike off, in which case damaging or destroying one or both Japanese carriers, giving obviously the US the advantage, then, yeah, they might be able to hold Wake Island, because if you can sink or drive off the Japanese carriers, you can then follow up with strikes on the Japanese landing forces and, wipe them out or drive them back or mixture of both, at which point Wake is held. And then, of course, there's kind of a middle ground where you might end up with either a mutual kill or mutual ineffectiveness. But it's a huge, huge gamble to take at the time, given, 1, it's 2-to-1 odds, and 2, Saratoga is one of precious few capital assets the US Navy has in theatre at the time. Paul Goyne asks, in several of your ship class videos you've said something along the lines of they were considering 15-inch guns until they realised they didn't actually have a 15-inch gun design. What exactly went into designing a large naval gun in the smokeless powder era, and why couldn't you, apparently, simply enlarge all the parts of your 13.4-inch gun by 12% and call it a 15-inch gun? So I have done a whole video on designing battleship guns and is it better to build a bigger gun and what are the challenges involved. And I think probably also the video I did on Yamato and her development, reflecting the development of the 18.1-inch gun, also covers a good chunk of that. So when it comes to designing a large naval gun, some of the restrictions will be things like your gun-making industry. Do you have gun pits long enough to heat and cool the guns as they're being built up? Do you have a industry that's capable of making a large enough billet and then forging said billet and drilling said billet to make the various components of the gun, including, of course, the barrel liner? And when it comes to the actual paperwork for designing the gun, while you could sort of just copy-paste, except at a larger scale, there are a number of dangers inherent with that. At a very minor scale, it might well just be inefficient, so you would end up with a heavier gun than you strictly needed. But also the engineering characteristics of the gun will change because, of course, if you expand bore, so that's a linear dimension, by 12% in the case that you cited, well, your surface area is going to increase considerably more than that, and your volume is going to increase considerably further still. And that means new and interesting stresses, because of course, even if you're keeping a 45 caliber length, the turning moments around whatever axis you choose to use, maybe the gun trunnions, will have increased somewhat more than your hypothetical 12%. So, for example, going from 13.4 to 15 inches, if you keep at a 45 caliber length, you've increased the gun barrel length by 6 feet. Now, because you're going to need a greater amount of explosive to propel the shell, some of that is going to be at the breech end, but thanks to, obviously, the explosive taking up volume, the greatest increasing component of things, then the majority of the length is going to be at the other end, which means the balance of the gun is going to be off if you keep the gun trunnions where they are. And even if you move that to where the new point of balance is, again, however many kilos, let's say, the last foot of your gun barrel weighs, is going to exert more force acting around that point of rotation than the previous last foot of the gun barrel would, because it's a further out distance. That's going to be more stress on the overall barrel construction, and that increase in stress may not be directly proportional to your simple 12% increase in size. And then you get into finer technical details like the rifling on the gun. If you just expand and extend the rifling by 12%, i.e. the liner, then you're going to lose the twist ratio that you had on the previous gun. It's going to become somewhat more elongated, and thus the ratio is going to drop because you have the same number of twists but over a greater length. So you're going to have to redesign the liner to conform with whatever twist that you actually want to retain. And so it goes on. Stuart Cork asks, if the Industrial Revolution had not happened when it did, or if it hadn't been put to use by cladding warships with metal and installing propulsion, how big could a first-rate wooden sailing vessel theoretically have gotten in terms of size and number of guns, and still been practical to construct and navigable using the materials of the time? And was there room for advancement in cannons to increase range without developing the propellant used in pre-dreadnought weaponry? With regards to the second question, there really isn't any point, because if we're talking about the 1850s going into the 1860s, cannon technology at that point could already throw shot several miles beyond any hope of actual accurate fire. Even in Nelson's time, a 32-pounder could easily fling a cannonball 3 miles. You were never going to hit anything from a ship at 3 miles, at least not hit anything you're actually aiming at. Your range of aim was 500 to 1,000 yards if you were lucky. And so, increasing the range of the guns to even more unrealistic distances basically doesn't change anything. All it means is you've got a more expensive, more powerfully recoiling gun, and you can't use even more of its range, which is essentially the case until rangefinders come along. The only reason guns really get all that much bigger between 1855 and 1900 is because of the advent of armour, and they need more and more power to blow through the armour. It's nothing to do really with range. Now, as far as how big could a first rate have gotten, they were pushing the limits at the time. Now, yes, I know people are going to be jumping up and down pointing to things like the Wyoming towards the end of the 19th century, saying, look, you could get wood ships that are far, far longer. Yes, you could get wooden ships that were far, far longer. But Wyoming was a freighter. A first-rate ship of the line has to support quite a lot of heavy metal in terms of its gun decks and so forth. That puts all sorts of different stresses on a wooden ship. And wood, any wood really, was approaching the limit of what it could do as a material in the hull form that was necessary for a ship to move through the water under sail propulsion. Now, if you wanted to build a gigantic rectangular barge that wasn't going to go anywhere under its own power and didn't have the stresses of masts and so forth, yeah, sure, at that point you could go considerably larger, but the stresses imposed by actually moving through the water under sail obviously impose additional strain on the materials that you're going to use, and that will limit your size because there's only so far you can get before the stresses and strains build up too much and the material starts to fail. And again, already in the 1850s and even slightly earlier than that, in an attempt to address these problems, ships had started to use iron strapping, because of course iron is considerably stronger than wood, and that was then being used to take some of the strain. Now, it's a good thing you mentioned the first rates, because first rates were inherently somewhat stronger and therefore could be built somewhat larger than second rates or frigates, essentially because, while I hesitate to use the term precisely because we're talking about wooden ship construction, not steel, but in very crude terms, you can think of each full deck on a ship as a kind of box girder. It has a certain amount of inherent strength due to its shape. Now, of course, as a ship is subjected to various stresses like waves, so you get hogging and sagging, that is going to flex. But if you add another box girder, wooden box girder on top in the form of another deck, that adds additional strength. So you can make your ship longer. Now, of course, it's not doubling the strength or anything like that, because you're also imposing stresses on the overall structure because of the additional weight you're sticking on. But it is a certain percentage. And while you will get a law of diminishing returns, if you put a third gun deck onto a ship, then its overall hull strength at any particular cross-section is stronger still, until you reach a point where the load that you're imposing will start to actually physically crush the material that you're using. And so that's why we've got the potentially hypothetical, potentially real HMS Duke of Kent model here, because as you can see, like the Santissima Trinidad, although Santissima Trinidad was refitted as such, Duke of Kent here was designed, at least ostensibly, as a four-decker from the start. So adding a fourth gun deck, if you were really going for broke, I think would have been the next logical step, because although it would only give you a relatively minor increase in overall hull strength compared to three gun decks, it would give you some, and then you combine that with iron strapping and you can make the ship even longer. But again, you are still going to be really pushing the limits of the technology of the day. Now, the largest first rates historically built were pushing a little bit over 260 feet in length. The longest wooden warships ever built, the Orlando and Mersey, were frigates, but built with huge amounts of iron strapping, and they hit 335 meters but had severe structural issues. So I would suspect if you went full hog and went for a massive four-decker built out of the strongest woods you could get your hands on and used loads of iron strapping and tons of cross-bracing, you could probably start to approach Orlando and Mersey's size, so maybe something in the 330 to 340 foot range. But I wouldn't like to see how that thing worked in a seaway. Jim Smitty asks, in episode 286 of the Drydock, you stated there are still details around the sinking of HMS Glorious which are still classified. This struck me as odd, given that as of episode 286, the sinking of the Glorious had been almost 84 years in the past. Do we know when these records will finally be declassified, and when they are, what can we expect to learn from these records? Well, ostensibly, some of the stuff relating to Glorious's sinking was classified for 100 years. Either that or 90 years. There's somewhat different opinions out there, because the 90-year rule was a former high classification rule, but in theory, there's also the possibility of rolling out 100 years, and depending on who you ask, some of the files surrounding the sinking were classified for either 90 or 100 years, which would mean that either they would be released in 2030, 5 years from now, or 2040, 15 years from now. Although I was recently informed that a whole bunch of documents relating to the sinking were actually quietly made available to the public in 2017, which is a little bit odd because that's 77 years after the sinking, which doesn't accord with any particular classification rule, but who knows, maybe someone reviewed some stuff and decided it's not worth keeping it classified anymore. So I need to go and hunt those documents down in the National Archives and take a look, although apparently they didn't shed all that much additional light on things. So whether that's all the remaining documents quietly placed into the public domain, or whether there's still stuff that's being held back, who knows? But as far as if there is stuff still being held back, what can we expect to learn? Well, I don't know. Anything that's been classified even up till the late 2010s, let alone into the 2030s or 2040s, it's got to be something that nobody could really have expected, or maybe a few people have expected, but for very, very strange reasons. Because let's face it, something as important as Ultra wasn't classified for this long. So, what exactly merits stuff being classified for this period of time? This is the kind of stuff where when it comes out, everyone goes, oh, that's new. That's very new. Didn't expect that. So we shall see, I suppose. Jeffrey Conley asks, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, did ships like Drake's Revenge and the Golden Hind have the same almost American level of guns of various sizes and types, like the ships of her father's reign as seen on the Antony Scroll? In the case of the Golden Hind, not so much, because the Golden Hind was a very small ship. I mean, if you go to the replica that's in London, you'll see what I mean. Now, the other problem with the Golden Hind is it is not entirely clear what armament she carried, because different sources give different numbers of guns and different types of guns. Now, of course, they could actually be reflecting exactly the same ship, just at different stages in her career, perhaps taking on armament from ships she's captured and so forth. But most sources seem to agree that she carried some demi-culverins, some sakers, and some falcons. One or two sources indicate she might have carried a few full-size culverins, perhaps in her bow, and one or two suggest that her biggest guns were just sakers with some falcons and some swivel guns. But everybody agrees there were sakers and falcons aboard. It's just where that you fall on the demi-culverin and culverin side of things. And so being somewhat small with small masts and a relatively small fore and aft castle, the bewildering variety of very small guns used for anti-personnel uses just wasn't there as it was compared to some of the bigger ships that you see on the Antony Roll. The Revenge, on the other hand, that was very much Antony Roll style armament. So at one point in her life, she's listed as carrying 2 demi-cannon, 4 stone thrower cannon, 10 culverins and 6 demi-culverins, and these are all down in her gun deck, so these are all fairly heavy weapons. And then in her castles, she has more demi-culverins, presumably for chaser purposes, sakers, the smaller guns, and all sorts of things like falcons, falconets, breech-loading guns, and she's got big enough and strong enough masts to potentially put guns up top as well. So, yeah, there's still a huge variety of guns on the Revenge, although compared to the Antony Roll ships, she has a slightly greater balance of heavy guns. It's almost, I would say, 40 to 45% of her battery is heavy guns, depending on, again, your source, maybe up to 50%, whereas obviously on the Antony Roll ships, they have a handful of heavy guns and then dozens and dozens of tiny ones. DM Phoenix asks, in your video with James Hansen, you stated that the Bismarck-class battleships were not an optimized design and that a ship with the same capabilities could have been built at a much lower tonnage. How low in tonnage would your idealized Fit Bismarck be compared to the historically accurate Fat Bismarck? And, in your opinion, which ship classes of any type were the most efficient in terms of capability per given tonnage in the steel warship era? So, in terms of the most efficient ships, well, at least if we restrict ourselves to battleships to make things slightly easier, I would say, certainly for the World War II period, the most efficient battleship design would be a coin toss between the South Dakota class and the Richelieu class. The South Dakota class, because they're essentially the only ships that show that, yes, you can actually build a fast battleship on 16,000 tons at something like 35,000 ton displacement with half-decent armour. Now, you do make a bunch of sacrifices in other aspects, including a somewhat inefficient hull form, so you need higher amounts of power to get up to a similar level of speed. But given that a battleship's objective is to have the most firepower and the most armour possible, managing to do that while retaining fast battleship speed on 35,000 tons is a considerable feat for which the engineers who designed it definitely need commendation. The competitor, I would say, is Richelieu, because although Richelieu obviously has a slightly lighter armament and compared to the South Dakotas, she is considerably faster and also is, roughly speaking, around 35,000 tons. And she's achieving that not by making an ultra-compact ship, but by having the magical force circulation boilers that the French had invented. Now, as far as the optimized Bismarck versus the historic Bismarck, well, I did do an entire video on how I would redesign Bismarck, but one of the things you've always got to bear in mind when you're thinking about redesigning Bismarck is how far from the historical reality do you want to drift, because there are things that you could have done to, at least in my opinion, redesign Bismarck to be far more efficient and save a considerable amount of weight, whilst mostly sticking within existing German technology and existing German design principles. So, for example, the Bismarck redesign that I mainly concentrate on in the video that I've done on it manages to consolidate the main battery into 105mm guns, drops the 150s entirely, and goes for an all-or-nothing armour scheme, but otherwise you can leave most of the rest of it alone. So 4 twin turrets using Krupp sliding breech block guns and all of this lot. Just going to all-or-nothing armour and rationalising the main armament saves you quite a bit, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 tons if you are careful. Now, you can go beyond that and find still further savings either in weight or increases in efficiency, but then you start to stray further and further and further into very alternate history, as opposed to this design choice could legitimately have been made just with a mere flick of a wrist on a piece of paper. So you could do things like introduce the 127mm dual-purpose gun the Germans were developing toward the end of the war sooner for naval use, which is theoretically possible, but a development timeline that is completely ahistorical. You could also presuppose that Krupp decides to finally abandon the sliding breech block and embrace the true saviour, that is the Welling interrupted screw breech block, which would allow you to have triple turrets on almost, not quite, but almost the same weight and footprint as twins. Now, I don't think would want 12 15-inch guns. You'd be better off with 9 in 3 triples. But then a 3 triple 15-inch Bismarck that has well-interrupted screw breeches instead of the 4 twin Krupp sliding breech block, that is a absolutely massive departure compared to its historic armament. And so on and so forth, things go on. So all these things theoretically could be done in Germany, but you end up basically having to go further and further and back in time to change them. Although one thing that I think almost everybody can agree on is just get rid of those wretched 37mm guns, put some flak Veerlings on, it'll do a lot better. So if you're trying to keep the capabilities roughly the same and the changes somewhat plausible, I reckon you can get Bismarck in at about 38 to 38,500 tons. You could get it all the way down to 35,000 if you go a little bit more out there, though. Greb asks, a couple of quick questions. What was the largest paddle wheel warship? I'm guessing the USS Sable and Wolverine. And second, as power increases to reach higher speeds, could a ship damage its paddle wheel just by trying to go faster? Well, I think the top two answers for largest paddle wheel warship do both involve some rather heavy caveats. Because if you count warship as armed ship in service to the government and formally commissioned as such, then technically the most heavily armed paddle warship ever was the SS Great Eastern when she was commissioned as a troop ship in the middle of the American Civil War to take British troops to Canada. She was armed, she was in government service, but she's a troop ship, so some people might not count that as a warship. Likewise with Sable and Wolverine. So if you're dismissing Great Eastern, then yeah, Sable and Wolverine would probably be in there with a shout. But again, they are training carriers. They're never actually designed for combat. And indeed, as far as I can recall, they weren't actually armed, which at least Great Eastern was. So if you want something that actually formally carries a prefix indicating that it's a warship, because Great Eastern was never HMS Great Eastern, then it would be Sable and Wolverine. But again, unarmed training ship, does that technically count as a warship? Who knows? Up to you, really. Now, as far as paddle wheels are concerned, going faster, would that damage the paddle wheel? It really depends on how you configure the paddle wheel, because of course, as you move faster through the water itself is moving past your ship more quickly. So the paddle blades, as they come down, they are entering a running flow. So if they're running at least as fast or faster, the relative speed is going to be much reduced. So they might not take as much damage as you might think. However, as I said, it depends very much on the paddle wheel design, because if you have a relatively shallow set of paddle wheels, especially non-feathering types, and you're just trying to go faster and faster and faster and faster, eventually you're going to get to a point where you're splashing as much water out of the way as you're actually displacing, and you're just going to end up essentially flailing the water under your paddles. And in that case, yes, you will have a fair bit of damage, because your paddles are going to be coming around pretty quickly, even relative to the water flow, and there's going to be all sorts of impact events and water surging back and scattering and everything. So yeah, that could cause damage. But if you were trying, or if someone said, hey, Drac, you have to decide and design on this really, really fast paddle steamer, then A, you'd want a feathering blade design that basically drops the blades in narrow side on rather than slapping the water. And secondly, the faster you want to go, the bigger and deeper you want those paddles to go, because rather than increasing speed to a point where you're now rotating ridiculously faster than the water flow around you, if you really want to go high speed on a ship, a full-size ship as opposed to some dinky little boat with a paddle, what you really want is something that has as slow a rotation speed as possible relative to the speed of the water, but has really, really big, really large paddle blades and an absolutely colossal amount of torque behind it, because then the incident speed when they enter the water is, relatively small, and then you're getting your speed by essentially just shoving a huge amount of water back, obviously at a slightly higher rate at any given point than the speed you're actually going, in order to ensure that you're accelerating. John McCarthy asks, in a recent dry dock, you mentioned there were many difficulties facing navies who wanted to transition from 2 to 3 gun turrets. What were some of the most challenging? In no particular order, there were tactical concerns about concentration of your battery. So if you take, for example, a 12-gun design, you can have 12 guns in 4 triples or 6 twins. Of course, if you take a hit in one of your twin turrets, you've lost 1/6 of your firepower. If you take a hit in one of your triple turrets and it's completely knocked out, then you've lost 1/4 of your firepower. And similarly, if both ships get 2 turrets knocked out, well, the twin gun ship still has 2/3 of its firepower remaining, whereas the triple turret ship has only half its firepower remaining. Triple turrets also weigh more, obviously, there's an extra gun involved, apart from anything else, and they take up more volume, and the barbette describes a larger area, and that means you need a certain size ship to be able to fit said gun turret, because of course the barbette will go down deep into the hull, and you need, at least if you are sane, a reasonable amount of spacing between the barbette and the turret and the hull of your ship, both for safety's sake in terms of incoming shell fire, and also for various structural reasons to prevent the hull becoming overly stiff at that point. And so if you are going to have triple turrets, that means you need the capability of building beamier ships than you would if you were just using a twin. And related to the overall volume and weight and cost of the turret, you've got a sliding scale of, well, you've added a whole extra gun crew in, but unless you're going to increase the floor area and overall volume in the turret by a third to compensate, you are going to have a somewhat less efficient turret. Now, the question is, are those inefficiencies going to be lost in other processes that are just hard time limits, or is it going to be so bad you're actually going to slow down your overall rate of fire? Then you've got, is this a twin or triple or a 2-gun or 3-gun turret? Obviously, we use twins and triples and quads for that matter as shorthand, but if you have a true triple turret as opposed to a 3-gun turret, so everything's on a common sleeve, then, well, if one thing goes wrong with one gun, 3 guns are out of action. Whereas on a twin turret, then obviously if something goes wrong, you've only lost that gun and the other gun temporarily. Obviously, if you go with a 3-gun turret, so everyone can move independently, that will help things, but obviously that's more complicated, somewhat heavier, and more expensive. And then, of course, you also have reliability, the whole probability and statistics thing, which I've tended to find over my careers, both as an engineer and as a naval historian, a lot of people do not understand, because if you have, for example, we have here, let's say, for the sake of argument, it's a triple turret, so you need everything to be working in order for the turret to work, all 3 guns. Now, if each gun has a 90% availability rate, that's actually pretty low for a gun, but it'll serve to make the point. So let's say you've got 90% availability rate on each gun. The odds of your turret working at any given time are not 90%, which some people say, oh, well, it's 90% for each gun, so it's 90% overall. No. The way statistics, and in this case probability, work is for each thing that you need to occur, in this case a positive result, so the gun is working and all of its breach and loading systems, etc. If that is 90%, and you have another identical system next to it, and you need that to work as well, then you have to multiply the first probability by the second probability. And in the case of a 3-gun or in this case triple turret, you have to multiply all 3 figures together. So it's 0.9 multiplied by 0.9 multiplied by 0.9. So if your system for a single, let's say 12-inch gun, has a 90% chance of being functional at any given time, a twin turret only has an 81% chance of being functional at any given time. And if it's a 2-gun turret, then there's an 81% chance of both guns being functional, but you may therefore have a margin where you might be able to use one or the other. But throw a 3rd gun into the mix, and now the odds of all 3 guns working, and in the case of a triple turret, therefore the turret working, have dropped to just a fraction under 73%. And yeah, at that point, you're starting to look around and go, well, for over a quarter of the time, my turret isn't going to actually be functioning, as opposed to around about 4/5 of the time it'll be functioning, and only 1/5 of the time it won't be for a twin. So reliability issues are a big problem. Now, obviously, even if you have a 99% availability ratio per gun, that still drops to around 97% for a 3-gun system. So you have to consider all of these factors and more, take various mitigation measures, and then try and, once you've taken all those mitigation measures, work out if the increased density of firepower has in fact been worth it, i.e. have you gotten more value out of it than pain that you had to put in to, sort the thing out in the first place. Leon Wu asks, it seems the Germans never recovered from the loss of their many destroyers in the Norwegian campaign. Why did they not replace them? Well, they did try, but a lot of the problem comes down to the fact the Germans didn't have a particularly large destroyer fleet to begin with, and so proportionally the losses were utterly devastating. So if you're looking at full-size destroyers, at the start of the war you have the Type 1934, the Type 1934A, and the Type 1936, and even that's stretching it a little bit because Z-22 only commissions a few weeks after the war has begun, but let's run with it. So that gives you a total of 22 full-size fleet destroyers. And then by the end of the Norwegian campaign, well, You lose 10 destroyers in the Norwegian campaign, plus you also lose Z1 and Z3 to friendly fire during Operation Vikinger. So you've lost 12 out of your original 22 destroyers. So by the end of the Norwegian campaign, you're down more than 50% of your entire destroyer fleet. Or to put it in another perspective, if the US Navy had sustained similar losses, so going with all modern destroyers constructed and commissioned before it enters the war on December 7th, 1941, if they suffered a similar percentage loss rate over a similar amount of time, then you would be talking about something like 55 destroyers sunk before the Guadalcanal campaign even kicked off. And that's with a navy that has a lot of older ships available in reserve and a whole ton on the stocks. The Germans don't have the money, the industrial resources, or the shipyard space, or the workforce to build destroyers at anything like the rate that the Americans can. And between the war starting and the end of the Norwegian campaign, they've only launched 4 more destroyer hulls, the first 4 of the Narvik class, or the Type 1936A if you want to be more precise. So although they keep laying down destroyers, it's not until they commission Z-34 in mid-1943 that they've even commissioned enough new destroyer hulls to make up for the losses suffered in the Norwegian campaign and Operation Vikinger. And by the time they've done that, well, there have been more combat losses. So it's only with the commissioning of the last few Type 1936Bs that they've even brought their overall destroyer fleet numbers back up to the size they were pre-Narvik, because, well, there have been more combat losses going on in the interim. Now, of course, they do seize a few foreign destroyers in their escapades, which help bulk up the numbers a little bit, but it's simply a reflection of what the Germans can actually build, and, well, also the fact they're building some pretty large destroyers. If they'd standardized on something a bit smaller like an Elbing, they probably could have churned things out a little bit faster. And if you're reaching towards the end of World War II, late 43, early 44, before you've come back up to even just having a couple of dozen destroyers on strength, and in the interim, the US and Britain have been pumping out a dozen destroyers every few months, or possibly even faster in the case of the US, well, yeah, suddenly you understand that they tried, but they were hopelessly outmatched. And this, incidentally, is what happened to one of them. This is the German destroyer that went aground in Romboksfjord. So this was me videoing it with my drone when I was up in Narvik last year. So hope you've enjoyed that footage. It's very interesting. It's just a shame the poor thing's fallen over in the last few years, hence you get this upside down view. But there you are. My drone can do many things, but lift half-track destroyer upright is unfortunately a little bit beyond its capability. Still, Romboksfjord is very nice at that time of year, as you can see. Waldo739 asks, when it comes to warships that had their batteries controlled by a central fire control, was it ever noticed or recorded that a particular turret or even a particular gun in a turret was more accurate than the rest? Like, was B turret more accurate because it was close to the centre of the ship, or was it less because it was higher up, since it was superfiring? There are definitely accounts from the period that indicate that some turrets and some individual guns were considered better and more accurate than others. Although it has to be said that usually, in the manner of sailors everywhere, when they're expressing these thoughts, it's usually not so much in terms of this gun or this turret was particularly good. It's more like this gun and this particular turret were pretty bad compared to the rest of us. But occasionally you do get various accounts that say, well, the left-hand gun was always causing us problems, but the right-hand gun, now that one always saw us good. Or similarly, people be like, well, that particular turret, yeah, that was always working and firing accurately, but the aft turret, just don't even bother. And it varied quite a bit. There doesn't seem to have been, at least as far as I can tell, any particular consistent pattern of, the left-hand gun is always bad, the right-hand one is always good, or the center one is always best, or superfiring turret is better than the deck-mounted one, etc., etc. It seems to be partly luck of the draw, because of course every turret and every gun is manufactured slightly differently, so there'll be very minor things, and it could even be something like 1/128th of an inch extra metal on the hinge of one breech block that makes it really stiff and difficult to close, whereas another one might have been manufactured to such a perfect tolerance that only the barest skim of oil gets in, but it opens and closes nice and snug like a dream. And similarly with turrets, build quality, whether a particular motor is going to be finicky, whether a particular line is working or not, all depends on build and installation quality. And then, of course, you also have to factor in for the quality of the gun crews themselves. So even if you have, by some magic, let's say you're on a 3 triple turret ship, you've got 9 guns in 3 turrets, and every turret and every gun is within shouting distance of each other build quality and reliability wise, well, if one of your turrets just happens to have crew who are a little bit more adept with their guns, or perhaps 2 of your turrets contain fresh drafts and the other one contains experienced veteran gunners, and one team is particularly stand out above all the others, then you're going to end up with that turret and that particular gun are really accurate, and the others are somewhat below it to varying degrees, purely on the strength of how good the actual gunners are. And of course, with the guns themselves, things like very minor warps in the barrel, how much the barrel has been worn, and all this kind of thing will also factor into it. Kra F1 asks, how knowledgeable were the Allies of the rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, and were there efforts to try and exploit this? As far as I know, not particularly. So they assumed that there would be a degree of rivalry because, well, there was a degree of rivalry between Army and Navy and Air Force in the Allied contingent, so it was reasonable to assume that would be the same in Japan. And very occasionally, you'll see reports about, Allied intelligence or observations on the ground indicating that perhaps coordination between the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy is not as tight as you would expect. And especially when it comes to the aerial component, because of course both the Army and the Navy have their own separate air forces, there is some confusion about, well, why are they duplicating efforts? Why does the Japanese Army have a whole range of fighters and bombers, and the Japanese Navy has their own complete range of fighters and bombers? Some of it was put down to, well, they've still got 2 separate air forces, so that kind of makes sense. But sometimes you can see hints of people going, but this aircraft really should be a common type, perhaps a long-range land-based twin-engine bomber. Why are they doing things completely separately? But an awful lot of what we now know about the rivalry between the Japanese Navy and Army came out in the aftermath of World War II. So although there are indications that perhaps not all is well, broadly speaking, like say with the Guadalcanal campaign, from an Allied perspective, you've got the Japanese Army fighting on land, you've got the Japanese Navy trying to resupply them, and the Japanese Navy is using ever more inventive and increasingly bewildering ways of trying to resupply them, and of course to attack the Allied forces as well. So from that perspective, even though the Navy and the Army might hate each other's guts, from a practical front-line view, well, they do appear to be trying to cooperate and look after each other. Same thing with, well, any resupply efforts across the Pacific, because the Navy has to resupply the Army in aid of the wider goals of the nation. So I don't think there was ever any concerted effort where the Allies sat down and went, actually, you know what, these guys, they absolutely hate each other. We must specifically run an operation to drive a wedge between them. That doesn't seem to happen. Nosdormu89 asks, it is known that Warspite and Enterprise both had plot armour. My question is, what other ships would you say had plot armour? I'd say Glorioso, definitely. Yeah, Glorioso definitely had plot armour, although of course it was a case of shields failing right towards the very end. Victory, actually, while we're on the Age of Sail, I would say almost certainly enjoys a degree of plot armour, because there is so many instances right from her initial launch through to her last days of active service where she could have been blocked in, extremely badly damaged, sunk, or considered too badly damaged to fix and repair before she gets her legendary status as the flagship of the Battle of Trafalgar. And even after that, she has a few close calls and run-ins, which realistically probably, even with her fame, should have seen her broken up or sunk. I would say also the battlecruiser renowned to a certain extent. I mean, for all the fact that she's been modernised, she ultimately is still a battlecruiser with a 9-inch belt. She's not the world's most well-protected capital ship, and yet she's constantly throwing herself left, right and centre into situations that theoretically on paper she should very, very well lose, but comes out of it pretty much unscathed in most cases. Or, in the case of Lofoten, the biggest amount of damage she suffered is what she did to herself trying to chase the Scharnhorsts. While we're on the subject of World War II, Prince Eugen I've described as something of a luck vampire. Every other ship in her class ends up in some way, shape or form incapacitated or sunk, and, well, almost every major German warship ends up in exactly the same way. Prince Eugen just pops out at the end of the war going, no, I'm still intact. Don't know what happened to the rest of you lot. And then, of course, you have a couple of Japanese destroyers that just seem to wander around, surviving everything while everything around them is sunk horribly. Sapper Ninja asks, in your 1942 video with John Parshall, you talked about how Pearl Harbor could have been worse if the dice rolls had gone more badly. My question is, what if the dice rolls had come up repeatedly low for the Japanese, with low damage, more misses, a couple of critical hit failures, etc.? How does 1942 go then? Things like, but not limited to, Arizona not detonating, Enterprise finding the Japanese fleet, Tennessee and Maryland not being hit at all, Nevada not eating a torpedo, etc., etc. I think, broadly, there are two lines in which the Japanese get a lot worse results on the day, but they have radically different outcomes on the rest of the war. So one option is the Japanese have achieved total surprise pretty much the same way they do historically, but things are just a little bit off. Maybe the ships that are hit outboard on Battleship Row are in even less of a ready state, so they flood and sink a little bit faster. So the ships inboard are physically protected from any further assaults by the rapid sinking of their fellows outboard. Maybe that bomb that nails Arizona historically goes just a little bit off course compared to what it actually did, ricochets off a turret roof, and therefore Arizona's still intact, and so on and so forth. So basically, a good chunk of the Pacific Fleet is either intact or only mildly damaged, at the cost of maybe 2 or 3 ships really badly torn up. That actually, in some ways, I think, could make things better for the Japanese. And that might sound weird, but I'll explain why. Firstly, you don't have the impact, quite literally, of the massive destruction of the Arizona as a rallying point to get the Americans fired up. Yes, there's been a surprise attack, but if the casualties are limited to a few hundred and most of the fleet is still there, it's going to be more we're annoyed about the treachery than we are about also the huge loss of life and the massive blow to prestige. That, in turn, might make the Americans a little more reticent. I mean, they're still going to go to war, but they don't have quite the same burning level of desire for vengeance that they do historically. Also, if you've got a good chunk of the Pacific Fleet's battle line still intact, there's going to be lots of questions about whether or not it should be used. And if the majority of the Kitabutai aircraft are still around, the absolute last thing the US Navy should be doing is sending out a bunch of slow, already proven vulnerable standard class battleships into deep water where the Kitabutai can have a second crack at them. But if you've got a lot of battleships, as I said, there will be a certain amount of pressure to use them. Now, the US Navy, to be fair, may not give in to that pressure, but that pressure is going to exist, and that could very well exacerbate matters because, apart from anything else, you're going to have to keep all the ships crewed, stocked. That's going to be a draw on resources, and you're constantly going to have to be fielding requests to send those ships into action. So, even if the fleet doesn't sail and they still restrict themselves to carrier ops, it is going to have an overall slightly negative effect on the US ability to conduct war in 1942. The flip side, And this can include not scoring a huge amount of damage as well. But the flip side would just be that the one where the Japanese got really lucky, where the radar station picks them up and gets ignored, well, now guess what? That radar station is actually listened to. And not only is the entirety of Pearl Harbor on alert, all the anti-aircraft guns are manned, all the ships are locked up tight, all watertight compartments sealed, but all the various aircraft are in the air. And maybe even someone phones up Enterprise and goes, hey, hang on a minute, there's a massive Japanese air raid coming in. Can you send your Wildcats to help out? And that is how things go really badly for the Japanese. Because if it's fully alert, loads of American aircraft in the air, anti-aircraft gunners all over the place, if they can cut a swath right through the cream of the Japanese strike pilots and fighter pilots, then you've basically crippled the Kido Butai's air wing almost from the word go, which means that follow-up attacks by the Kido Butai in aid of the expansion across Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific are going to be much reduced, if they're going to happen at all. There's a possibility that Operation C might not happen if they're still reconstituting the air groups. If Operation C doesn't happen, then the British are going to have or continue to maintain a naval force much closer to Japanese holdings, and that could cause them some problems. I mean, ABDA command's probably still going to go as it did historically because it doesn't involve carriers, at least on the Japanese side. But it also means that come, let's say, Coral Sea, if the Japanese don't have as many or as experienced pilots left, maybe they don't manage to get Lexington. And now there's a snowball effect where the US has more carriers, the Japanese have less aircraft. Midway, I mean, there's not really many ways Midway could go even worse for the Japanese, except perhaps if Hiryu's air group is much reduced, maybe they don't get Yorktown. So now suddenly there are 2 carriers available for the US that they didn't have historically. And then everything very rapidly snowballs, and by the end, towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese Navy could be on an even more of a back foot than it historically was. Stafford Magnus asks, on the Nelson-class battleships, why wasn't C turret superfiring instead of B turret? I understand that doing so would have blocked the conning tower, but in some cases it would have meant the ships could have fired all 9 guns directly forward at longer ranges, which, if history had been slightly different, might have meant Rodney scoring some very long-range hits on the initially stationary but rapidly accelerating Gneisenau. What were the reasons for this choice? There were a few different reasons. One of the biggest ones was in terms of rear arc of fire. Now, of course, as an all-forward ship, the Nelsons couldn't fire directly aft the way that a ship with 4 and aft turrets can, but the ability to cover at least a good chunk of the rear arc was considered. And the thing is that the aftmost turret will be restricted in its arc of fire by both the physical presence of the superstructure and safety considerations about the blast effects caused by its guns going off so close to the superstructure. And those considerations apply regardless of whether it is at main deck level or if it's superfiring, because the superstructure is even taller than it is. Conversely, if you make B turret the superfiring one, it obviously can actually theoretically, as long as the other 2 turrets don't have their guns aimed way up, it can actually do a full 360 spin. And because it is much further forward, then if it swivels back to shoot essentially over the ship's shoulder, it can actually get a much finer aim aft, so much closer to firing directly aft, without said blast effects completely wrecking the superstructure. Of course, there were still issues with that, but it meant that, at least on paper, the Nelsons had more coverage in the rear arcs by having a superfiring B turret than the aftmost turret being superfiring. And related to this was the placement of the secondary battery, because in some of the earlier designs designated O3, and there are actually 2 separate O3 designs, but the O3 design that eventually leads to Nelson, it actually starts off with the aft turret being the superfiring one, much like you see on the F2 and F3 battlecruiser designs. But that's done in part because at that point the secondary battery is adjacent to the superstructure, and the F2 and F3 designs also have a much smaller superstructure than, in terms of deck area, than the Nelsons ended up with. And so the aft turret has to be superfiring in order for the gun barrels to not smash into the forwardmost twin 6s. Whereas in the Nelsons, the secondary battery is eventually, as the O3 design moves on, moved right aft, which means that the aftmost turret actually can rotate a reasonable amount back without hitting anything. And the last issue that I've seen, and believe it or not, yeah, this is actually a genuine consideration, is that this spacing with the superfiring B turret is very fractionally, and I mean by a couple of feet, slightly more efficient for shortening the citadel, because there has to be some clearance when you've got a superfiring pair. You have to have some clearance between the superfiring turret and the turret that's in front of it to avoid clocking the lower turret with your guns and the worst of the blast effects, assuming that you keep the barbette relatively low. You can put the barbette higher if you want, but obviously that involves adding weight, so they don't want to do that. But of course, turrets overhang barbettes, both fore and aft. And if you have superfiring aft, then two turrets at the same level, then in order for all the turrets to swing past each other nicely, the middle turret has to have its gun barrels a little bit set back from the back of the turret wall, or gun house wall, for the forwardmost turret. So that involves, a few feet relative to the barbette. Whereas if you do it this way round, then the aftmost turret, its guns can come really up close to the superfiring barbette and actually under the overhang of B turret. And then you have the same spacing that you have up front. So just that little bit of overhang, you're saving probably a couple of feet. But when you're trying to squeeze something like the Nelsons into 35,000 tons, every little helps, as they say. Ian Carr asks, you've previously commented on the R-class battleships being limited by their rather compact plan area. Were plans prepared for more extensive upgrades, and what was the ultimate limiting factor as compared to the Queen Elizabeths? Although the R-class are technically slightly younger than the Queen Elizabeths, the things that really limit them as far as the British are concerned going forward through the 30s and into the 40s is, one, they're slightly more compact, and that gives you limited amounts of volume and deck area for further upgrades. And two, partially as a result of being more compact, they are also slower, and the British appreciate that obviously capital ship speeds are ticking up. So what that means is that when they are considering which ships to modernise, despite the fact the R-class armour layout is actually a little bit better than the Queen Elizabeth's, they realise that, well, if you're going to fully modernise either the Queen Elizabeth's or the R's, the Queen Elizabeth's, because they have much more volume and surface area, they can actually fit a pretty good anti-aircraft armament, like you see with QE and Valiant. And because they are already, at least in theory, going about 24.5 knots, you can plug new machinery in and save space and, roughly speaking, maintain that speed, which, okay, it's not the 27, 28 knots of a modern fast battleship, but it's still a somewhat useful speed, especially in a navy where a number of carriers like Eagle and so forth are not really going to be any faster and, in fact, could be somewhat slower. Whereas if you do the same swap-out machinery deal on the R-class, well, you're going to be limited to somewhere between 21 and 23 knots, depending on the ship and depending on how the bulges are working out. And you have proportionally less volume to play with in the first place. So even if you do want to add in anti-aircraft weapons, one, you can't add as many. Perhaps you'll be limited to twin 4s instead of 4.5s. And maybe you could only have 6 or 8 mountings instead of 10. And your magazine space is going to be less because there's less overall volume to save by putting in new machinery. Or if you try and push the R's up by just doing a like-for-like floor area with modern machinery, then you don't have the additional space you need for your anti-aircraft magazines, and it all gets very messy. Now, there are some plans for a little bit more upgrades to the R-class than most of them historically get, except that the epitome of most of those plans, not all, but most, is Royal Oak, and of course she's the one that gets sunk. So theoretically, you could have brought the other R-class up to Royal Oak standards if the Royal Navy had a bit more time and money in the late 1930s, but, well, they didn't. In terms of even more extensive to do a, at least a relatively limited QE style upgrade, no, as far as I'm aware, they never seriously looked at those plans. And part of it is because the R-class's fate keeps getting put off and put off, because when they're looking at what ships do we keep around, which ships do we modernize, what are we doing with modernizing our fleet overall, in the early 1930s, as the London naval treaties start to expire, or at least the Battleship Building Holiday part of them does, the British are thinking that they're going to still be under a treaty system, so they have to ditch ships to bring in new ships. So their initial plan is that the R-class will be retired as the King George V's come online. So at that point, they do a round of overhauls in the early 30s, and they're thinking, right, that'll be enough to see them through the next 5 or 6 years. Then the King George V will come online, and we'll be scrapping them. And then, of course, as tensions ratchet up, they decide, actually, no, you know what, we're not going to scrap them. We're going to keep them around. But what we are going to do is because our shipbuilding and armour manufacturing industries have managed to increase their capacity somewhat, now we're going to scrap them instead as the Lion class come online, and we're going to scavenge their 15-inch guns for some sister ships for Vanguard. And then, of course, the Lion class is cancelled and war is declared, and you are not really in a position at the start of that conflict to scrap any battleship, no matter how more or less capable it might be. But they've obviously, having been fitted out in such a way as they're expecting to be decommissioned at the end of the 1930s, then being told they have to hold off for another 2 or 3 years, and then being told not only are they having to hold off for 3 or 4 years, but those last 3 or 4 years are also going to be under wartime stresses, the R-class very rapidly start to degrade. And so that, given at the end of the war, pretty much it's maybe Nelson and Renown of the pre-war stuff that they're looking at maybe keeping around, the R-class really don't have any prospect of extensive upgrades, either in the middle of the war or afterwards. ACC asks, following up on last month's Drydock question about the interwar naval treaties and whether or not they were a net success, your analysis understandably focused on the perspective of the Allies, but what were the goals of the future Axis powers, and did they consider the treaties to be a success? And perhaps broader, if such a thing could be said to exist, what were the treaties itself goals, a neutral fictional outcome that everyone said the treaties were supposed to cause? Well, covering the last bit first, in theory, the treaties, at their most optimistic, were supposed to set a path towards global disarmament. Yeah, someone actually believed that. Yeah, as if the biggest powers on Earth were ever going to disarm themselves. That's not how humanity works. On perhaps a slightly less pie-in-the-sky level, the treaties were, at the very minimum, supposed to freeze the naval balance of power at a ratio that, under the table, was effectively no one in theory should kick off because no one has enough of an advantage to actually win. Because assuming that everyone is acting on their own interests, if the Royal Navy, if the British decide to kick off a war against everybody else because they no longer have the massive doom fleet of World War I, as long as the US and an other navy gangs up on them, they're outnumbered. Similarly, if the US decides to go full imperialism, the British and the Japanese, if they gang up, outnumber them. If the Japanese tried to go whole hog, well, it turns out the British and the Americans definitely outnumber them. We practiced that one in real life. And the French and the Italians, well, they were allowed to have a navy, basically. Of course, this didn't factor in for what various industries could do if everyone dropped the treaties, because of course everyone was supposed to follow the treaties. So it was designed to, in some ways, minimize conflict by almost enforcing a mutually assured destruction concept of a sort. Now, as far as what the future Axis powers thought of the treaties, well, the Germans at the time of the Washington and First London treaties, weren't allowed to have much of a navy at all by the Treaty of Versailles and were otherwise excluded from the treaties. So their opinion of the treaties was, we could get so lucky. And in fact, the Anglo-German naval agreement was predicated in a large part on essentially using the existing naval treaties as a framework, which is why when people say, but Germany was never signed up to London 1 or London 2, therefore Bismarck isn't actually treaty breaking. As I've said before, go and actually read the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Although Germany doesn't become a signatory of London 1 or London 2, in the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the Germans do agree to abide by the current international treaty system as far as the design of capital ships and warships as a whole is concerned. The fact that they don't is another matter entirely. But that leaves the two future Axis powers that were part of the treaty system. For the Italians, for the majority of the treaty period, the Italian approach was, well, navies are expensive. They cost many, many lira. And in terms of lira, we have no lira. So the Italians were mildly okay with the treaty. I mean, they didn't particularly like the fact that they were now signed up to be equal to France. And France wasn't particularly happy about being signed up to be equal to Italy, for that matter. But in the grand scheme of things, considering that neither France nor Italy could actually even afford to maintain the tonnage allowances they'd been given, then, as far as the Italians were concerned, well, at least as and when they recover their economy, the French can't, by treaty, outbuild us, and we can think of inventive things to do in the interim. So they were kind of fine with it until they decided to build a full-on battle fleet in the mid-30s. The Japanese, on the other hand, well, they were split. They overall weren't particularly happy with the treaty as it stood originally, because the 553 standard that was handed down, or 15-15-10, they wanted it to be just a little bit tipped more in their favour. They were prepared to accept having a smaller fleet than the Americans, who they viewed as their primary threat, but they reckoned that if they could have 11 or 12 ships, then between choosing the time and place of battle and, theoretically, at least according to them, having qualitative superiority, they thought they could handle the US fleet. But they recognised that if it was a 15-10, they probably couldn't. It was a very, very narrow margin, but that's what their calculations were based on. And so they weren't particularly happy with the treaty the way it actually panned out. But on the other hand, there was a significant faction of Japanese naval officers whose opinion was, well, it's not ideal, but it's limiting the Americans far more than it's limiting us, because they were aware of just how, in for a penny, in for a pound, the Japanese economy had been in the 20s to fund the big naval race. So as far as they were concerned, maybe Japan could build its fleet up to be twice the size it was when it was limited by treaty. But they were very conscious the Americans and possibly even the British could build up their fleet to be 5 times the size it was, even compared to when it was limited by treaty. And limited by treaty, they were still bigger than the Japanese fleet. So, yeah, at that point, even if the odds weren't necessarily in their favour, they were a heck of a lot closer than they would be without a treaty. Therefore, it was better to have a treaty, because then you could plan your breakout path to maybe grab equality or close to it before anyone realised what was going on. Whereas some other people were just like, no, stuff it, we don't want a treaty, we should build whatever we want, and maybe lost sight of the fact that you probably don't want the Americans and the British to go, oh, okay, we're doing another naval arms race in peacetime, are we? Right. A.B. Coates asks, how effective was naval minesweeping in the time period that the Channel covers? How certain could a navy be that they had cleared all enemy mines in their target area? And are there any notable examples of navies either over or underestimating their own minesweeping capabilities? Well, points at Gallipoli. There's a good example of massively overestimating you're massively overestimating your own minesweeping capabilities and massively underestimating your enemy's ability to lay mines. That's probably the best example. There are a few others as well. But coming over to how effective was naval minesweeping, in the abstract, it varied very considerably, even if we limit ourselves to the early half of the 20th century, where your basic minesweeping gear is paravanes, like you can see demonstrated here. Because the technology and tactics used by minesweepers and then the mine layers and the mines themselves varied and constantly as people tried to one-up each other, and that meant the effectiveness of minesweeping would vary, because you'd start off with the basic theory of a moored mine, like you see here. Then the paravane catches said mine, cuts its line, mine pops to the surface, and the mine can be then dealt with. But then you have the idea of, well, what if we moor mines at different depths? And some of them will be deeper than the normal paravane sweep can go. Yes, they'll only catch some of the bigger ships, but those are the most valuable targets, which then means you might have to do multiple sweeps with a paravane. So, okay, you've added a time factor to sweeping, but fine. But then you have magnetic influence mines. Now, magnetic influence mines can rest far below the ability of paravanes to sweep and may not even have mooring cables. They may just be negatively buoyant if you drop them in shallow water, at which point your paravane sweeps are useless and you have to use some other method of setting the mines off. But it also means that your minesweepers now have to be, ideally, with as small a magnetic signature as possible to stop them being blown up. So now you have to invent degaussing and also magnetic influencing coils to try and set mines off prematurely. That's why you have the weird UFO-shaped Wellington adaptations, amongst others. You can also have some free-floating mines, although they are of relatively limited use because they tend to drift off randomly. You've also, even with moored mines, in particularly strong currents or tides, they can be swept back and forth. So you might sweep a channel one day, and if you have a particularly strong tide, there might be mines in that channel the next day. And even if we're back into the realm of your fairly standard moored mine, there are various counter-mine sweeping technologies that could be put into the mines, like specially strengthened cables or cutters on the mine cable to cut the paravane cable before it pulls the mine cable into the paravane cutter. Small explosive charges to destroy the paravane. So yeah, you sacrifice that mine, but by taking out the paravane, it means that further mines in the channel might not be swept. So as these technologies are developed and minesweepers develop counters, and depending on who's put what kind of mines in what locations, the effectiveness of naval minesweeping constantly swings back and forth. Mike Lima 777 asks, until the Town-class destroyers of the Lend-Lease program, it seems that very few destroyers within the period covered by the Channel were named after cities or towns. Was this a coincidence, or was it because using city names for a ship type that literally includes destroy was seen as poor taste or tempting fate? Well, it comes down to a few different factors. Firstly, naming ships after cities or towns had a relatively long pedigree, going all the way back to the Age of Sail. And when city and town names had been used, they tended to be used for ships of the line. Now, depending on which navy you're looking at, obviously this can vary, but broadly speaking, fourth rates and third rates, so anything from 50 to 80 guns, tended to be the thing that would most commonly carry a city name. Now, of course, there are exceptions like the Ville de Paris in the Marine Nationale, or La Royale as it was at the time. And, of course, the US went with state names for its ships of the line, mostly because they didn't have that many ships of the line, but there you go. But between that tradition and the fact that a large enough city or town to merit a name tends to want something relatively survivable to proudly carry that legacy, when destroyers first come about, these things that weigh a few hundred tons at most, they're not really big enough, proud enough, or survivable enough, frankly, to carry, the impressiveness of a city or a town's name that might have hundreds of thousands or millions of people in it. So those names tend to end up being on cruisers of various permutations. Plus, quite frankly, any navy of any significant size will end up building so many destroyers, torpedo boat destroyers, torpedo boats, contre-torpilleers, whatever you want to call them, that you may start running out of towns that anybody has any particular name recognition for, especially if you're using cities for cruisers still. There's also the small fact that if you are naming your cruisers for cities and towns, at least the big ones, i.e. the big towns and cities, then you can kind of assure people that, yeah, your turn will come, we're just rolling things over, because the number of, let's say, cities in the UK versus the number of cruisers in the Royal Navy in the first half of the 20th century, even if you don't have a cruiser name for you now, well, the next generation of cruisers, you might well get something. And there's also, okay, and admittedly, yes, the Royal Navy does have some very odd names, but when you start going down to the really obscure towns, which you'd need if you were naming all of your destroyers after towns, you'd get some really, really weird names. I mean, even leaving out the somewhat more impolite ones, who's going to be intimidated by HMS Binfield? Or perhaps the mighty HMS Cheddar? Joshua Dworkin asks, after listening to your collaboration video in 1942, I was struck with just how many capital ships the Royal Navy lost leading into that year. My question is, would swapping the outcome of the Battle of Denmark Strait, i.e. Bismarck sinks and Hood survives, have made a significant difference in capital ship outcomes in other battles, both by having another pseudo-fast battleship available and avoiding wear and tear on the forces that went after Bismarck when Hood was lost? So there are, I think, 3 big losses that the Royal Navy suffers capital ship-wise, which you could look at between the loss of Hood and the start of 1942. So that's Barham, Ark Royal, and then, of course, aforesaid Prince Wales and Repulse at the end of the year. Now, if you'd say, let's say we've got the night action that Admiral Holland wanted, and let's say they get the jump on Bismarck and Prince Eugen, perhaps, let's say, for sake of argument, obviously the British are closing in using their radar, and they're summoning Norfolk and Suffolk plus the destroyer swarm. The destroyer swarm starts attacking, Bismarck opens fire, Bismarck knocks out its radar, and therefore Bismarck is only aware that there are British capital ships out there thanks to Prince Eugen's hydrophones, but not exactly who they are or where they are because they can't see them. And as a result, while the destroyers are attacking and dropping torpedoes left, right and centre, Prince of Wales and Hood get the drop on Bismarck thanks to, well, the destroyers lighting up Bismarck either with setting it on fire with shell hits or with searchlights. They blast it into oblivion. Norfolk and Suffolk shortly thereafter do the same to Prince Eugen. So effectively there's not much battle damage to Hood. Hood is still going into Drydock for a relatively extensive refit because she is really on her last legs at this stage, machinery-wise. Now, is she going to get the full-on modernisation that everyone would dearly love her to get? Probably not, due to the pressures of war. But you can probably take some cues from the refit that Renown went into for a few months in the latter stage of 1941. So general repairs, touch-up, machinery at least patched up, if not upgraded, and plenty of radar and other modern systems added. And so she may lose her conning tower as a quick patch job to make up for that. So it might take a bit longer than a couple of months, but let's say she survives. So she goes into Drydock in June, probably comes out in maybe October, something like that. Now, with that said, Hood's not going to affect Barham's loss at all. Barham's operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. Even if Hood was in tip-top mechanical shape, she's not going to be assigned to the Eastern Med. So Barham's still lost. Ark Royal, though. Now, you might be thinking, well, how on earth can Hood prevent the loss of Ark Royal? Well, bear in mind that Hood spent a fair bit of the early part of the war assigned to Force H. Renown then kind of took her place, and then Renown went off to get refitted. So Ark Royal, in terms of capital ship escort, is basically alone when she is torpedoed at the tail end of 1941 in November. If Hood is coming out of Drydock in, let's say, early October, I can see a fairly good case being put forward to either send her to Force H to escort Ark Royal, or for Renown to be sent back to Force H instead of assigned to the Home Fleet, and maybe Hood is assigned to the Home Fleet. Either way, there will be a capital ship escorting Ark Royal in November 1941. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily stop the torpedoing, but it will mean that there will be more destroyers in Force H serving as escort, which means there is a greater chance that one of them is not only going to pick up the U-boat, but also take it seriously and prosecute the attack. So that could avoid the torpedoing at all. Or maybe the U-boat decides, oh, there's a battle cruiser out there, we'll torpedo that instead. And, well, either Hood or Renown is much, much more capable of eating a torpedo than Ark Royal is. So Ark Royal possibly lives. And then that brings us on to Force Z. Now, Force Z will be an interesting one. If either Renown or Hood gets torpedoed in the process of effectively meat shielding Ark Royal, then Force Z is probably going to go pretty much as it did historically, because whichever ship is going to be in dry dock, so effectively the force strength is back down to what it would have been historically capital ship-wise. However, if that doesn't happen, and both Renown and Hood are available, then I think that changes things for the deployment of Force Z. Because at that stage, having Renown around to deal with potential Scharnhorst issues, King George V around to deal with potential Tirpitz issues, Duke of York beginning to come online, etc. Most of the logic for releasing Prince of Wales is still there. But then you've got Hood as an extra, and you've got Repulse, which is obviously sent out to with Prince of Wales. Now, although Renown and Repulse are somewhat dissimilar since Renown's upgrade, I can see somebody going, hang on a minute, we know Renown saw off Scharnhorst and Gneisenau at Lofoten, so why don't we pair up Renown and Repulse? So now we have Renown and Repulse to counter Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and either them working as a pair or various King George V's can deal with Tirpitz. Ideally, the King George V will deal with Tirpitz. The Renowns will deal with the Scharnhorst, but maybe the Renowns can help gang up on Tirpitz if she sails. And that means perhaps Hood gets sent to the Far East with Prince of Wales. And if during her refit Hood has had her bulges updated, well, when the Japanese attack Force Z, Hood is by far the larger target, the most obvious target, so they'll probably go for her instead of Prince of Wales. Hood is a bit faster than Prince of Wales, and so she might avoid the hits. She might still take hits, but the chances of Hood taking an identical hit to the one that wrecks Prince of Wales' propulsion is very slim. And her refitted anti-aircraft battery is going to be much better than Repulse's, and unlike Prince of Wales's, it'll probably work as well. So now you've got a bigger anti-air threat, a possibly damaged Hood, but still intact, but still, afloat and mobile, and Prince of Wales with what is working of her anti-aircraft battery still able to work because she hasn't taken that aft hit that knocks out all the power. So you've got two very much alive, very much active, very much manoeuvring capital ships throwing up as much AA as humanly possible, which means, I think at that point, given how lucky the Japanese got with the unintentional pincer on Repulse, and of course their early hit on Prince of Wales, while I can see them landing some hits on one or the other or both, there is a non-zero chance that both ships will manage to survive the torpedo attack, at which point the Japanese are out of torpedoes, both in the air and at their base, and they're out of torpedo bombers, because those are the only ones they've got in the theatre. And yes, they can rush more torpedoes in or bring more aircraft in, but by the time they do that, Prince of Wales and Hood, or possibly one or the other, will have limped home to Singapore, got patched up, and then potentially contributed to the defence of Singapore, and as and when Singapore almost certainly still falls, made their way elsewhere, which means, +1 or possibly +2 capital ships to the RN's overall balance of forces, in addition to the fact you've got Hood anyway. And it now means you have 2 fast capital ships available as free agents in the start of the Pacific campaign. Now, of course, if they have taken one or two aerial torpedo hits, they will need to be repaired, which means, depending on the severity of the damage, either heading for Australia or heading all the way back home again. But it is still going to put the Royal Navy in a somewhat better position going into 1942. Sergeant Schultz asks, I'm reading Norman Friedman's book on US cruisers and thoroughly enjoying it. In the section on the 1910s US battle cruiser designs, there's mention of a statement from Admiral Roslin Weems, Royal Navy. Without fast units, the US Navy would find it difficult to counter the Japanese Kongos. As we know, the US Navy never ended up with any battle cruisers, so my question is, what was the US Navy's plan to deal with the Kongos if a war did occur in the 1920s or early 1930s? The US Navy seems to have thought of a few different options to deal with the Kongos, depending on what the situation was. Their ideal circumstance, which is part of the reason why you see the Pacific Fleet concentrating so much in numbers, is that whereas previously, at the time that Weems is writing, when the US has a decent number of battleships in both the Atlantic and Pacific forces, by the 20s and 30s, the majority of American battleship firepower is in the Pacific. So the idea then is, well, if the US battle line so heavily outnumbers the Japanese battle line, then in order to plug the gap and not get their battle line absolutely crushed, the Japanese will be forced to insert the Kongos into said battle line, which would negate a good chunk of their speed advantage. And, well, in a firepower contest against the US battle line, pretty much any US ship either has more guns or bigger guns, so at that point they should be dealt with there. There were other possibilities. There was some talk of using the aircraft carriers as and when they came in, not necessarily to sink them, but at least to do enough damage to slow them down, where they could then be mobbed by battleships. There was also some talk of destroyers and cruisers, because although the Lexingtons had become carriers, they still had the Omahas and the Wickses and Clemsons, which were pretty quick, certainly considerably faster than the Kongos. So there was some discussion, and in the fleet problems, some practice of these very fast units essentially charging down the Kongos and torpedoing them, although that was expected to be a relatively high casualty tactic. There was also some analysis, certainly as time went on, as to what could the 8-inch guns do against the 8-inch armour of the Kongos, and then a whole graph was drawn up about, if you get within 10,000 yards, then potentially the fighting power of a more rapid-firing 8-inch cruiser in the abstract might start to equal or exceed that of a Kongo, i.e. it can do more damage to a Kongo faster than the Kongo can do to it, and if you have more than one, then even better. So as more and more of the 8-inch cruisers come along, there's a possibility of charging down to close range and engaging in a short-range firefight, pretty much like what San Francisco did to Hiei, although again, this was not expected to be without significant casualties. Or you could try and combine multiple of these, so perhaps the aircraft carriers slow down the Kongos, and then the destroyers go in with torpedoes while the 8-inch cruisers go in with guns and hit them that way, or get the battleships involved once they've been slowed down. So basically, most US hopes to deal with the Kongos either centered around slowing them down in some manner so they could be mobbed by everything, or artificially restricting their speed by forcing them into a battle line where the battleships could deal with them. Alex Moskowitz asks, during and after the Battle of the Denmark Strait, were there any consequences of a bunch of British ships suddenly leaving their existing duties to go after Bismarck and Prince Eugen? Weirdly enough, there doesn't seem to have been all that much. I mean, apart from the fact that Rodney flogged her propulsion to within an inch of its life, but she was getting refitted anyway. The only real significant changes that seem to have resulted were Mashona, here, tribal class destroyer. She was sunk by the Luftwaffe on her way back from her efforts in the Bismarck chase, being an extremely rare example of a ship underway being hit by German level bombers, in this case Heinkel 111s, albeit she was travelling in a dead straight line at 15 knots, so, even then. So she was lost, where perhaps otherwise she wouldn't have been, and convoy SC-31 diverted to Iceland just to stay out of the way of Bismarck's potential course, so of course that was somewhat delayed. But other than that, the number of attacks and sinkings on Allied merchant ships and so forth during the period when Bismarck is still at sea, and shortly thereafter as various ships that were pursuing her head off to refuel, rearm, etc., it doesn't seem to have budged all that much. It just seems to be the same general level of attacks and sinkings as there had been previously and thereafter. Although when I was going through the various records, I was highly amused to see that the submarine HMS Thunderbolt actually sailed out from Halifax in the vague hope that she might be able to make an intercept with Bismarck, presumably if Bismarck had continued going west, which does render some rather interesting counterfactuals. You know, if Bismarck hadn't taken that hit up in the bow from Prince of Wales and decided to continue on, there's every potential that her career could have ended in a flurry of 10 torpedoes from Thunderbolt apropos of absolutely nothing. I mean, it's incredibly unlikely, but it is possible. Camino John asks, naval, coastal and port fortifications during the Age of Sail. Question A, did they utilise the same cannon that were available to the Navy in question, or did they do something different? I can see the benefits of using the same, but perhaps also the same shot with a longer barrel to enhance performance, or heavier shot weights and charges. And B, did they practice and sight their guns? In terms of practicing and sighting their guns, it's a very mixed bag, depended pretty much on who was commanding the fort. Theoretically, yes, you could do so, but the simple fact was that gunnery and the windage and quality of cannon and shot at the time was such that even if you did pre-sight your guns, pre-sighting one gun didn't mean the gun next to you would you be able to use the same settings, and even if you were just looking at one particular gun or you individually pre-sighted every gun, the next cannonball that you loaded in might have completely different flight characteristics and still miss by a couple of 100 yards. So there was a limited benefit to pre-sighting the guns, but it was mostly in terms of getting the crews used to estimating ranges and making corrections pretty quickly. And as I say, it depended very much on who was in command in a fort. But on the other hand, since ranges were relatively short and the basic science behind it was pretty simple, it did mean that for the most part, if a fort knew it was going to come under attack in the next few days or weeks, you could usually get a degree of, at least a rough idea of what your various ranges were in fairly short order. Now, as far as do they use the same cannons as the Navy in question, yes and no. So there were different weights of gun for the same shot weight. So, for example, the 32-pounder came in at least half a dozen different cannon weights. And obviously some of those were optimized for ships and others were heavier and less wieldy, less useful on ships, but could perhaps be used on land. So there were some heavier guns that could perhaps take slightly heavier charges, although not shot weights, because that tend to be dictated more just by general war. But you would also get a lot of naval guns or ex-naval guns because, well, those were the ones that were being manufactured en masse, so they were the ones that would be most available. But unlike ships, which at least in British practice would tend to get their armament cycled relatively regularly when they went into port for refits and repairs, forts tended to just get issued guns, and then that was pretty much the guns they would have for a very, very, very long time to come. They might occasionally get supplements to replace ones that had completely worn out or broken, but they weren't going to get regular changes of weaponry the way that warships would. And so you could end up with some slightly worn naval guns, some brand new issue guns, some more specialist land type guns, and whatever weird old odds and sods happened to be around that they fancied giving you. Which could lead to some very strange armaments, like the fact that when the Royal Navy went in down the Dardanelles in the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, some of the Ottoman fortifications included those massive great bombards that they'd last used to batter down the walls of Constantinople hundreds of years earlier. But generally speaking, outside of brand new prestige fortifications, perhaps around the capital city, and maybe not even then, forts tended to get the short end of the stick when it came to being issued with armament. You were just lucky if you had enough guns and enough ammunition and powder to man the battlements and emplacements that you actually had. Ben asks, what submarines were sunk or significantly damaged by merchants without significant assistance from escorts? Did it happen often? It didn't happen very often, but it wasn't unheard of. Now, there is a little bit of a grey area, like here with the U-14 in World War I, which was sunk by a pair of armed trawlers, because, they are merchantmen, and they dealt with the U-14 without recourse to escorts, but they were themselves armed. But then a lot of merchantmen were armed in World War I, and to a certain extent a fair number of them were armed in World War II as well. So in that grey area of, if a merchantman is armed and deals with a U-boat, does that count or not? So that aside, purely in terms of merchant ship see U-boat, merchant ship use hull as weapon, merchant ship ram U-boat, U-boat sink, there's at least half a dozen cases of this happening to German U-boats in World War I. Now, it obviously doesn't happen quite as often to British and French submarines, etc., simply because there aren't as many German merchants out there for them to hunt, so I'm using U-boats as kind of the yardstick there. So, half a dozen incidents at least of subs that were sunk. I haven't gone into just subs that were damaged and managed to limp home. Over the course of 4-ish years of war, as I said, it's not unheard of, it's not common, but it does happen. And in World War II, I suspect, although I haven't gone through all the U-boat losses, I suspect it's going to also still have happened, but be somewhat less common, because in World War I, considerably more U-boat attacks were made at or very near to being surfaced, whereas in World War II, obviously, the vast majority of U-boat attacks, especially as the war really kicked into high gear, were made by U-boats that were just having their periscopes up above the water, and therefore somewhat less liable to be rammed by random merchantmen. Salami Sales Express asks, Drac, given the recent explosion of a bulk coal carrier, how often did coal bunkers in coal-fired ships explode? I know bunker fires are common enough occurrence, but I haven't heard of a bunker explosion that was purely from dust or outgassing. While there were plenty of coal bunker fires, and some of them obviously led to explosions, as far as I can recall, there weren't any coal explosions or coal bunker explosions directly in major warships. And I think that's for a few reasons. Firstly, obviously, there's a huge number of crew on a warship relative to its size compared to a merchant ship, so there's a lot more checking of the coal. Secondly, being a warship, the coal bunkers tend to be designed with a little bit more in the way of things like vents and so forth. So if there is a problem in the coal bunker, there's more options to deal with the problem. Third, obviously, warships tend to use the coal in the coal bunkers, so people are just turning that coal over, moving it around and seeing what's going on more often. Obviously, it doesn't prevent fires necessarily, but explosions, there were coal explosions aboard ships during the 19th century, but they, at least as far as all the examples I've found, are universally limited to ships that are carrying coal in bulk. And I think that's for a few reasons. Firstly, obviously, those kinds of vessels, they tend to just put huge amounts of coal in and seal it up, so any outgassing is somewhat contained and can reach critical levels, and there's a lot more of it in one compartment, which means that, small amounts of outgassing from any given amount of coal can build up to very large and dangerous levels because of the very large amount of coal involved. Also, whereas coal that's being loaded into ships tends to be hand-loaded for the last part of the way down into the ship, and therefore breaks up less. Coal that goes into merchant vessels tends to just be literally thrown in. So you get a lot more breaking up of the coal, which can then lead to a lot more oxidization and issues arising from that, as well as obviously dust being generated as stuff breaks up. And related to that, ships, coal bunkers on warships each hold a certain amount of coal, but each bunker is, relatively speaking, small compared to the compartments on a collier or similar vessel carrying a huge amount of coal for commercial purposes. And again, similarly, therefore, there's less chance for something truly lethal to build up as compared to on a merchant vessel. So yes, there are coal bunker explosions, but they seem to be confined mostly to commercial colliers rather than warships. The radar light of the new moon asks, during the West German Navy's rearmament in the late 1950s, they decided to refloat a Type 21 and a couple of Type 23 U-boats to fill out their initial submarine fleet. Even accounting for the fact they were somewhat spoiled for choice in this matter, what technical difficulties would you expect them to face in terms of bringing these U-boats to full operational capability? Well, I think there'd be a whole list, but the three biggest ones I can foresee are, one, the technology on board is going to be 10 plus years out of date. So, things like sonar and radios, etc. So all of that's going to have to be replaced. Secondly, these things have spent a bunch of time on the bottom of the sea, so you're going to be replacing all that stuff anyway, because it's probably all rusted out, and a whole bunch of other stuff is going to be rusted out. So, okay, some of the stuff, like copper pipes and stuff, can probably be cleaned, but there's going to be a huge amount of reconditioning, cleaning up, replacement, etc., etc., dehumidifying, if you don't want everything to grow mold, just to, bring them up to even a livable standard, let alone an operational standard. And the other problem, as I kind of intimated in my videos on the Electra boats, is simply that the build quality of the various modules used to put them together at the end of the war was somewhat appalling. So even when they managed to get modules that actually fitted together, I suspect that going over the salvaged U-boats, there would probably have to be a lot of remedial work done to bring the boats up to full operational capability. Now, of course, the fact they were made operational in the first place, at least operational enough to be taken out and scuttled, would indicate that they at least weren't using the worst of the various modules that were sent over. But if I was the West German Navy, I would be going over the seams and joints of those modules with a very, very, very fine-tooth comb before commissioning them into any Cold War-era Navy. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, pondering the doomed fate of PQ-17, if the ships had not been ordered to scatter and the four heavy cruisers actually did end up facing off against a more aggressive Tirpitz, what could they have reasonably have hoped to achieve? And as part of this, it strikes me that Tirpitz had a friendly port much more nearby than Bismarck or Graf Spee ever did. Do you think German High Command should have been even more willing to risk battle damage accordingly? Well, dealing with the latter part first, by this point, the Kriegsmarine was in a serious bind as far as fuel availability went. So the fact that there was a friendly port considerably closer by was very heavily countered by the fact that, well, they didn't have a lot of fuel to use, and actually the battle groups that the Germans had put together were considerably larger than the battle group, well, the two ships that had been sent out as part of Operation Rheinebung. And so fuel demands would be incredibly high. So, I mean, yes, in theory, German High Command probably should have been more willing to risk their ships to achieve results, but routinely risking their ships would have run them out of fuel oil incredibly quickly. And because of the loss of Bismarck and Graf Spee, etc., by this point, the Kriegsmarine was incredibly risk-averse, which didn't help. Now, going back to the first bit, if you had an actual confrontation between Tirpitz's battle group and the collective cruiser and close escorts of PQ-17, it would have been a very interesting fight, because theoretically, the Tirpitz has 4 large destroyers, 2 large torpedo boats, and the cruiser Admiral Hipper with it. And the Anglo-American force would consist of 10 destroyers, 4 heavy cruisers, the Tuscaloosa, Wichita, London, and Norfolk. And then, of course, you've got various trawlers, minesweepers, and all the other smaller escorts with the convoy. But I think they would have stayed with the convoy. So it would have been 10 destroyers versus 6 destroyer-ish size vessels, and then 4 heavy cruisers versus a heavy cruiser and a battleship. That's not actually as unfair a fight as you might think, because the Anglo-American destroyer force outnumbers and, frankly, is just better than the German destroyers, because the German destroyers have all sorts of stability issues, as I've gone over many times before. So, yes, the German destroyers might be bigger and have slightly more firepower, but considering there are more Allied destroyers and they're going to be able to handle the Arctic seas considerably better, I have a feeling the destroyers are going to get the Allied destroyers would get the better of their German counterparts if indeed there was a face-off between them. And because they have superior numbers, there's also a good chance that the Allied destroyers could launch a torpedo attack on the German capital ships. Because bear in mind, obviously, the Allied force can concentrate into a force that can punch straight at Bismarck, whereas the German forces are likely to be deployed in a fairly wide screen trying to find the convoy. See Battle of the Barents Sea for an example of that. Now, putting that aside, whether or not the destroyer torpedo attack helps, my personal way of trying to fight that particular fight, and bearing in mind you might not get a choice in terms of timing, because Tirpitz is the attacker here, and there's very long hours of daylight. There's not a huge amount of darkness. Ideally, I'd like to attack in the hours of darkness to close the range and exploit my radar. But let's assume that we can't do that. My temptation would be to take the Wichita, maybe with a couple of the destroyers, and use her to stand off against HEIC, because Wichita is the most heavily protected of the heavy cruisers. And I think she stands a pretty good chance of getting one over on HEIC, especially if she's got a couple of destroyers to back her up with torpedo runs and so forth. That then leaves me with Tuscaloosa, London, and Norfolk to take on Tirpitz. Now, this isn't a brilliant lineup, because Tirpitz is more than capable of sinking any of those cruisers. But the reason I'm using that particular formation is because, we're assuming the destroyers have gone in and done their torpedo runs already, the 2 British heavy cruisers also have torpedoes, which is something of a great leveller. And, of course, being 3, they can attack from multiple vectors at once, so it's kind of shades of the Battle of River Plate here. Now, yes, the 8-inch guns can't penetrate Tirpitz's belt armour, but, as was shown with the final battle with Bismarck, 8-inch guns can still do a heck of a lot of damage to the upper works, critically the fire control, secondary battery, and general seaworthiness of a Bismarck-class battleship. So what I would be trying to do is use the 3 heavy cruisers coming in from 3 different angles to try and smother Tirpitz with 8-inch shells, with the objective of chewing her up badly enough to either make her break off or substantially impair her fighting ability to the point that she can't just execute all 3 of the cruisers one after the other. You're probably going to lose at least one of the cruisers in this attempt, but hopefully at some point Wichita will finish off HEIC and be able to join in the fight as well. And maybe even the destroyers might join in once they've finished off the German destroyers, or they might be there all the time, spitting torpedoes and gunfire at Tirpitz, which might increase the survivability of the heavy cruisers. Now, of course, there is the possibility that HEIC might get a few good hits in and send Wichita packing, and the destroyers might get very tied up dealing with their German counterparts, and then Tirpitz, if she lands a lucky salvo early on, only facing off against 2 heavy cruisers, can probably deal with them in short order. So there is a possibility of the German battle group, with some damage, blasting its way through the escorts and then falling on the convoy. But there is also a reasonably decent chance that the collective escort force might well be able to do enough damage to force the Germans to turn back with losses. Even if they don't necessarily sink Tirpitz, they can at least chew her up quite badly. And of course, if the Norfolk or London survive long enough to get into closer range, they can also drop their own torpedoes on Tirpitz and try and cause further problems that way. Wienve, an old patron making a return, asks, there has been a lot of discussion online about the next incarnation of James Bond, and one popular theme is that the new Bond should be a World War II veteran, and the film should be set in the time period of the original books. I think this is a great idea, but if we imagine that Bond's background should be at least semi-realistic, then what kind of Royal Navy officer do you think Commander Bond should be? My mind immediately goes to one of three possibilities. One, is Royal Navy adjacent, but you could make him a commander from the Royal Marines. That would obviously give him a lot of shoreside combat experience and kind of special forces infiltration style stuff, which would lend those skills towards being a spy later on. However, if you wanted to say, right, it absolutely has to be a Royal Navy commander, then I would say to give the most adaptable set of skills that would lend themselves towards spycraft, I would go with either someone from the X-craft branch of the submarines, maybe submarines as a whole, but X-craft specifically if you could pick, because, well, those are very much special forces missions, sneaky, adaptable, self-reliant type of people, perfect material for a Bond-esque kind of hero, or potentially, and I think you could probably see this one coming, an ex-destroyer captain, because they have to be a little bit mad, very free-thinking, energetic, capable of being very sneaky at times, not averse to a bit of operation ashore, potentially could have been involved in some of the various landings and raids off the Norwegian coast and so forth. So I think all three of those archetypes would fit Bond, but would offer slightly different elements to how you wanted to portray him. The Royal Marine Commander Bond would obviously be very much more oriented towards the action part. The X-craft one would be a very sneaky, very cunning person, whereas the Destroyer Commander Bond would have some sneak and some cunning in there, but would also be a very confident person, perhaps more suited or at least more capable of infiltration by walking in the front door and just, having that natural leadership ability to convince people that he is who he says he is and not a British spy. Whereas Submarine Commander Bond would never go near the front door with a 10-foot pole. He'd be out back planting unseemly amounts of explosives around everything he could find. Percy Antica asks, I don't know much about wood or shipbuilding, so forgive what might be a very basic question, but what size would a tree need to be suitable for warship construction? And is that a major impediment to using some woods like lignum vitae or Brazilian ebony as the structural timbers of a ship of the line? I've heard of both being spoken of favourably in terms of hardness or durability, so I wonder why they're not up for consideration as shipbuilding material. So with woods like lignum vitae or Brazilian ebony, there are a number of other factors just beyond durability. Firstly is rarity. You do need a huge amount of timber to construct a warship. So if, let's say, 1 in every 100 trees is the one that you want in a forest, i.e. of the type that you want, you're going to be going a very, very long way to gather enough wood to build a ship. Another aspect is, as along with the rarity, is what else they can be used for. Like lignum vitae, very good essentially at being self-lubricating for things like pulleys and so forth. Very much demand for other uses than mass ship timber. And therefore also a lot more valuable and therefore also a lot more expensive. Then you've got another problem, which is just difficulty of getting to the blasted things, because Brazilian ebony or lignum vitae, or indeed jarrah, they grow in all sorts of weird and wonderful places very far away from where most people are building ships to the line. So there's the increased difficulty and expense of finding them, cutting them down and hauling them back to whatever shipyard you're using. And then, of course, there's also the fact that, well, much like jarrah, any wood that is particularly hard and durable, which is theoretically a very good thing for a ship, usually is actually also incredibly difficult to work. So even assuming that you can work it reasonably well, you're going to go through an awful lot more effort and an awful lot more equipment for something that's going to therefore cost a huge amount of money, all other factors aside, which will then be somewhat more durable, but also an absolute pig to repair, because it means you're going to have to keep stocks of that specific wood around when the ship inevitably gets a cannonball shot through it. But size-wise, it really depends on what you're using that particular bit of timber for, because obviously you do need some pretty large trees to make things like frame timbers or keel timbers. But you can get away with sections of tree or smaller trees for a lot of other stuff. I mean, you can obviously build the keel, and they often did, and the frames up out of sections of wood anyway. And at that point, you're looking for things like, say, for the knees, you're looking for particular joints between a trunk and a bow. So as long as it's thick enough at the trunk and the bow to make the overall depth of the wood, then the overall size of the tree doesn't matter so much. So you can have very large trees, which are very useful. You can have smaller trees that are quite useful. You could have trees of any size that can be divided up into lots of individual portions to make lots of individual timbers for a ship. The main thing, to be honest, is consistency, and that's where things like oak tend to win out, because, at least at the time, it's available in exceptionally large amounts relative to the other woods. It's somewhat easier to work, and it's usually available much closer to the shipyards. Bill Luster asks, several historic ships have been raised and preserved for display in different ways since the 1960s. American Civil War era monitors, Mary Rose, Vassar, etc., etc. Now, while Mary Rose is largely left alone and presented almost as a ghost ship of sorts, USS either Cairo or Cairo, I can't remember, is under a tent with timbers to show what's missing. CSS News, I think, is similar, but with a full-size replica built alongside, actually similar to Monitor. If you had to pick another ship to reasonably raise and preserve, which would you pick and how would you present it? If I had my personal pick, I'd probably pick HMS Victoria of the Camperdown collision, because, well, apart from anything, we don't have any full-sized late-period ironclad battleships preserved anywhere. And she does have the hilarious thing of, being wedged nose down in the seabed, so there's clearly a decent amount of structural strength left in her. Now, as far as how I would preserve her, what I would do, actually, is something modelled after a technique I've seen with paintings. So, with some paintings and that kind of art, if there is damage to an area and they know what that area should look like, I have at times seen cases where they preserved it by basically painting a series of lines separated by whatever the backing colour is of the canvas or the plaster or whatever. So you end up with like a hatched pattern. So that helps to, from a distance, fill in the artwork and make it generally just a better piece of artwork for display. But when you look a bit closer, you can see, right, this is original, this is restored. And for the Victoria, I would do something similar. So take her off the seabed, clean her up. What's there that is viable for keeping can be kept. And what's left, because I say I'm pretty sure she has a decent amount of structural strength left to her. What's left and that has gone missing, stuff that might have fallen off or rusted away or maybe been too weak to preserve, that could then be replaced by something that is perhaps in a modern material, something very lightweight, maybe either aluminium or fiberglass or something. And that could be appropriately coloured. So if she's restored and repainted to her original condition, maybe use a slightly lighter shade of paint in the restored areas, or maybe use a flat grey or something. Basically, something that gives you an idea of this is the original ship and this is what she would have looked like, but these bits are left over. And then I think you could probably do something a bit like they've done with the Monitor M33 in Portsmouth in terms of touring her. Although, of course, as with any ship that sinks, there is the issue of people died aboard the ship, but usually. But people, you have different views on how to treat that. Other candidates, to my mind, would be maybe there's potential that there's another Lake Nemi ship out there in Lake Nemi, and at which point, hey, there's a purpose-built display hall for them right on the edge of the lake, so haul it out and preserve it there. Or my favourite perennial, stop people fighting in the Black Sea so I can go down into the incredibly toxic depths of the Black Sea and find, I don't know, a Phoenician or Greco-Roman trireme or merchant ship in absolutely perfectly preserved condition and haul that up. Probably end up inventing like 16 new branches of science to preserve the thing once it comes out of the toxic soup that is the bottom of the Black Sea. But hey, I'd have an absolutely unique thing to have as the centerpiece of a really cool museum. And then I could go and get more. Little Dweller asks, while I understand the value of armed merchant cruisers, on balance, do you think it was worth arming ordinary freighters such as Liberty ships during World War II? It didn't seem to bother the U-boats all that much, even when they were able to penetrate the escort screen and move on the surface between the columns of freighters, and the weapons the freighters carried certainly wouldn't worry a surface raider. Well, there's a Hills cruiser or two that might disagree with that one. How often did freighters use their armament to engage an enemy or have its presence deter an attack? And would the money and displacement dedicated to the guns have been better spent on more cargo capacity or just making the ships a bit cheaper? I think overall it probably was worth it on 3 grounds. Firstly, morale. Morale was very important in the merchant service for World War II. And simply knowing that you could shoot back did wonders for morale on merchant vessels, whereas if you went in completely unarmed, morale would tank quite quickly. Secondly, while obviously the German U-boats executed most of their attacks from periscope depth, and therefore the freighters weren't able to use their various deck guns against them, the simple fact that the Germans could assess that probably, even odds or better, any ship they encountered probably had at least a gun of some description, meant they had to attack from underwater. Otherwise, they risk, some little 6,000-ton steamer putting a 4-inch shell straight through their conning tower, and now they're out of action at best. So much as the arming of merchant ships in World War I was concerned, by forcing the submarines to operate under the surface and use torpedoes, it vastly limits the utility of those submarines as compared to if they're able to relatively freely surface and use deck guns, which they have much more ammunition for. So it limits the U-boats' ability to sink vessels because, well, they've got fewer weapons to use on said vessels. And of course, if they miss, that's a very expensive torpedo gone. And thirdly, particularly in World War II, a lot, if not all of the weapons, not all of them, but almost all of them, ended up being either dual-purpose or dedicated anti-aircraft armament. And, of course, ships under air attack, well, they definitely could and definitely did shoot back quite often against those. And while you wouldn't necessarily be guaranteed to shoot much of anything down with a single Liberty ship's armament, if you have a whole convoy of them spitting various calibers of shells at incoming aircraft plus the escorts, it does tend to put the enemy a little bit off their attack run, which in turn, can preserve ships. It could turn a hit into a miss. It could turn a near miss into a complete miss. It could turn a hit into a near miss. It could mean that you score fewer hits. Maybe, you only score a couple of hits with your bombs instead of 7. And so overall, as a deterrence value for the number of ships that were most likely preserved by them, even if they don't shoot down too many aircraft, I think it's definitely worth it. Will Sanders asks, the 5.5-inch gun was ordered by the Greeks, then used by the Royal Navy for a few ships, but not beyond a brief fascination. Why so? Was it another of those performance minima, like the Soviet 180mm and US 10-inch guns? In some ways the opposite, in fact. The Royal Navy actually quite liked the 5.5-inch gun, which is why it was installed as Hood's initial secondary battery, for instance, because it offered very nearly the same firepower as a 6-inch gun, but for a somewhat lighter weapon and one that was much, much easier to load, just because the weight of the shell and the charge felt just that little bit lighter, which now entered reasonable human use ranges. I think the problem for the 5.5 inch was twofold. Firstly, in the post-treaty environment, with the Royal Navy basically having to kind of hold off and retain a whole bunch of its older ships, most of those ships where relevant, so cruisers and secondary batteries on capital ships, had 6-inch batteries. So, well, why break with tradition? Rather than create a division where these ships have 5.5-inch guns and need 5.5-inch shells, and these other ships have 6-inch guns and need 6-inch shells, better just stick with the 6-inch. In an environment where the Royal Navy was less constrained, perhaps there wasn't a Washington Treaty or something like that, I can potentially see the 5.5-inch carrying on. Another thing that worked a little bit against it was suddenly the need for anti-aircraft guns. And at least in the early 20s, the Royal Navy settled on the 4.7 for that. And then there was something of an argument of, well, if we've got the 4.7-inch, which is a relatively heavy gun for the period in terms of anti-aircraft-destroyer-based weaponry, the 5.5-inch isn't that much heavier than the 4.7 and is a purely anti-surface weapon. So if we're going to have a dedicated anti-surface and a dedicated anti-air gun, then we might as well have a dedicated anti-surface gun that hits a little bit harder. And, well, we already have one of those. It's called the 6-inch gun. So there were events conspiring against it, but there are potential timelines in which the 5.5-inch actually becomes the standard armament of the Royal Navy for what would later be called light cruisers and possibly even capital ships, especially if somebody could make a way of making an anti-aircraft version. Red Ranger asks, in regards to the Battle of Jutland, did anyone in the British Admiralty think to cable the Russians and tell them something to the effect of, the majority of the high seas fleet is away from home. If you have any naval assets that can make a mess of their port facilities, now is the time to deploy them. Or were there reasons why this wasn't done, such as too great a risk that the Germans would intercept it? And that being said, if the Russians did deploy whatever they had available, what could they have accomplished? It's a combination of intel, security, time, and forces. So, although the Russians had actually given the British some of the code books that they used to crack the various German naval codes, if the British had transmitted, hey, the Germans are coming out, and in any way, shape, or form the Germans had picked this up, then obviously that would have exposed their intelligence capabilities. Secondly, the Russian forces in the Baltic would have taken far too much time if they're just blind out of nowhere told, oh, in less than 24 hours the high seas fleet is sailing. I don't think they could have gotten a significant size force steamed up, mobile, out into the Baltic and then down to Kiel to do anything before the high seas fleet was pretty much on its way back. And thirdly, you've also got to take into account, as I said, balance of forces. The Germans have coastal defences, the Germans have minefields, and the Germans, although they have one squadron of pre-dreadnoughts that set out with the high seas fleet, pretty much everything that's left of their armoured cruiser force, every other operational pre-dreadnought, various coast defence ships, and other craft not suited for operation with the high seas fleet are still back in various German ports, which means that the Russian Baltic fleet, which is not particularly large at this point, would have to contend with those. Basically, the only things the Russians have that are absolutely 100% better are the Gangot-class battleships, and there's not that many of them compared to the minefields and the submarines and the destroyers that they'd basically be bull rushing through. So even if the Russians could summon their entire fleet and get it down to the German northeastern coast in time, without either the Germans twigging from an intercepted transmission or from the Germans going, hey, it's a real mighty coincidence the Russians just so happened to scramble and turn up just as we were all away, the Russians would still probably take unacceptably high losses in an attempt to fight their way through to the German ports. Gris asks, the video released regarding dedicated anti-aircraft cruisers got me thinking about the role of battleships in the Pacific and how they ended up playing anti-aircraft fortress. So my question is, just how many dual-purpose and dedicated anti-aircraft guns could be fitted on a vessel that was dedicated to the role, but given the displacement of a North Carolina or even an Iowa-class battleship, particularly if the plans had to be run past Willis Lee until he was happy with barrel count? In theory, a lot, but maybe not as much as you might otherwise think. Now, there's two ways of interpreting the displacement part, because, of course, if you're making a dedicated anti-aircraft vessel with the displacement of a North Carolina or an Iowa, you don't need to include things like incredibly heavy citadel protection. So you could get a anti-aircraft ship that is the displacement of an Iowa class that would be physically considerably larger than an Iowa class, because you're putting all the displacement that you'd normally have into the main battery and armour into lighter armour and just a bigger hull. Now, if we took the slightly more normal approach of saying, okay, what you mean is an Iowa-class hull, well, obviously, Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts isn't 100% accurate, but something I pointed out in the past is if you look at something like USS Wyoming, despite the fact that she was rigged up by the end of the war to really be an anti-aircraft training vessel, she didn't actually fit that many more anti-aircraft guns than she did main battery guns, because, well, if you look at the 5-inch 38 put in place of twin 12, it occupies less space, but not substantially less space in terms of overall footprint. Although, again, with that, you were using pre-existing barbettes, so maybe you could have gotten, so let's say, 3 twin mountings, maybe 4, if you had just the hull without the barbette already in place. So, in this example, I've knocked together a basic Iowa-type hull. So you've got the superstructure with the 10 twin 5-inch 38s there already. And then in place of the aft turret, I've got a stepped series of 3 twin 5-inch 38s. And in place of the forward turret, I've got a stepped series of 4 twin 5-inch 38s. And yes, you could argue there's deck space to carry them even further forward and aft, but you do have to remember there has to be some form of citadel, and unless you want to go full Gangot style and armour the whole thing bow to stern, you have got to draw the line somewhere. I've tried to keep it roughly within the environs of where the historic citadel was. And then you can see also at either end, I've added pairs of twin 5-inch 38s abreast of where turret 2 and turret 3 would be, because of course in this circumstance where the centerline turret's 5-inch 38s, the blast effects, which is why they don't, well, one of the reasons why they don't extend the 5-inch 38 runs that far fore and aft, in reality, those blast effects don't exist because there aren't 16-inch guns there. So you've got 9 twin 5-inch 38 mounts for a dedicated broadside of 18 guns as broadside only weapons, and another 7 on the centerline, which can go either direction, so that's another 14. So that gives you a total of 32 guns that you can point in terms of heavy anti-aircraft guns against an enemy on a given broadside. Or in other words, you have 25 twin 5-inch 38s for a total of 50 barrels. Now, if you were going to do this in real life, they may be a little bit more conservative. They might knock it down to 20 to 22 barrels, perhaps to fit considerably more Bofors 40 mils, which I didn't bother putting in on this particular layout. But that would be about what I reckon you could fit on an Iowa hull. Bajaki Hilmarson asks, in the movie The Cruel Sea, the new crewmen haven't ever been at sea and have no experience. Can it be that this was based on reality? I would say a qualified yes, in as much as everyone's got to go to sea for the first time at some point. Now, obviously, in a peacetime navy, you would go out on a training cruise or possibly even on a training ship before you're formally inducted into the navy. But obviously in wartime, if you're a new recruit, well, there aren't peacetime training cruisers and training ships. Everybody is at war. Now, does that mean you physically will never have been on a boat or a ship at that stage? Almost certainly not, because you will have had at least some basic training, at least if we're talking about the Allied navies and even the Axis navies for the majority of the war. But you will probably, in terms of a wartime recruit, probably only have done maybe harbour work, maybe a little bit of coastal work, almost certainly not have done any kind of deep ocean sailing. Unless, of course, you had prior experience of that in a civilian life. And likewise, in terms of training, you would have had some basic training, but again, on land or maybe on a moored ship or something in a harbour, not full-on training at sea. Now, of course, ideally, you would want people to have this training. That's why they do it in peacetime. But when you're trying to get every single person you possibly can to crew every single ship you possibly can, you are inevitably going to end up with people for whom this is their first time properly at sea in a live combat situation. So from that perspective, yes, the new crew, or some of the new crew, potentially won't have been at sea and don't have any actual real life experience. But as I say, that's not exactly unheard of across any of the service branches in World War II, especially as people get desperate. So obviously, in the USA, if you deploy to the front line as a fighter pilot, you will have had some fairly extensive combat training in real live aircraft before you're sent on board a carrier air wing or something like that. Whereas, as we know, some Luftwaffe pilots were basically in a position of, well done, you managed not to crash a glider. Here's an ME-163, have fun. Fireteam Joker asks, I've heard that the French, after World War II, put armour on their ARL-39 and ARL-44 tanks that were salvaged from the French battlecruiser Dunkirk. Did they really just slap on some battlecruiser armour and on a tank? It's a little bit more complicated than that. So they absolutely didn't use Dunkirk's plate on the ARL V-29, simply because the ARL V-29 was built while Dunkirk was still in active service, at which point, there would have been a lot of angry French sailors chasing people in that case. However, with the ARL-44, bear in mind they built less than half a dozen of them as prototypes, they did use some plating from the Dunkirk to do that. And it wasn't for the entire tank. As far as I can tell, and bearing in mind this is looking at French sources, so my French translation may be a little bit off, but as far as I can tell, the issue wasn't that the French armour industry in the immediate post-war environment couldn't make things like the front glacis armour. It was that the French armour industry had issues making the complex shapes for the turret. And so for the ARL-44's turret, they took some, what for Dunkirk would have been relatively light plates, and welded them together to form the turret, or most of the turret, or the gun house, if you like, of the ARL-44, although apparently the mantlet for the gun was manufactured fresh. So essentially, yes, the ARL-44 did use some plates from the Dunkirk, but as far as I can tell, it seems only in the turret. Excelsior 1 asks, we know there have been bow extensions done during refits, but has anyone ever thought about doing a stern refit, perhaps to a transom type? Would it be possible, or would the original hull form and rudder and propellers make such a change impossible? It seems like a transom stern has proven to be a better design overall. There are a few problems with stern refits that aren't really present in bow refits. Firstly, ship's sterns tend to be somewhat fuller right up towards the end, compared to a bow, which is very fine, and thus every foot that you remove or extend a stern is going to have a dramatically greater impact on both the ship's overall displacement and its trim, its balance, than adding or taking away from a bow is going to do. Another problem is, of course, the rudder, and therefore the steering gear, is housed right towards the stern, so any significant reduction in the stern could potentially impact on the steering gear installation, possibly a stern anchor if you've got a stern anchor there, and various other bits of equipment. Another big problem, and probably the biggest of all, is that while a bow cuts through the water, that is its job, and it can do this in a variety of ways, the stern of a ship will usually be very carefully designed, assuming the designers have done their job properly, to take maximum advantage of the way that water is flowing down past the rest of the hull and is being churned up by the propellers underneath. And so altering that in any significant way could mess with the flow that they've calculated, and therefore the resistance that's being generated, and therefore the ship's speed and power efficiency. So while it is possible to modify the stern of a ship, and this has been done on rare occasion, it's a far, far more difficult and involved process that may not really be possible, depending on the design, as compared to a bow extension, which is, relatively speaking, an easy job. Tankodromis asks, in your video on the big night battle at Guadalcanal, you talked about Admiral Lee taking Washington into battle. Was he in command, or was there a captain? And was it possible in World War I or World War II to have an admiral in command of a ship and a formation at the same time? So Washington definitely did have a captain, Captain Davis, who actually was decorated for his command of Washington during this action. But the situation with Washington was a little bit more complicated than normal. Firstly, Lee obviously was a very technically minded officer and was a little bit more involved with day-to-day ship operations than most admirals would be. And secondly, when an admiral is in charge, usually the admiral has a fleet. So the admiral would be worrying about what the fleet is doing while the captain is worried about what the ship is doing. Whereas by the time of the confrontation with Kirishima, well, Admiral Lee had started out with a few destroyers and 2 battleships. The destroyers were gone, and then South Dakota had vanished off the map. So you were in a situation where you roughly knew where South Dakota was, but couldn't really communicate with her, which meant that Lee's sum total practical command at that point was Washington. Now, with that said, that meant that Lee was essentially forming tactics for a fleet of 1, which then kind of overlapped his commands with the commands for Washington, because, well, that's who all the commands were for. So, yeah, a little bit of a very unusual situation going on there. But with that said, Lee was not giving orders directly to all of Washington's crew, according to both Lee's account and the account of other people who were aboard at the time. Lee basically did a similar thing to what happened at the Battle of Manila Bay, where you get the famous quote, you may fire when ready, Gridley. Lee was standing there with Captain Davis, and when he had determined that the tactical situation was optimal, he then said to Captain Davis, I would like you to open fire, and then Captain Davis gave the order to open fire to the ship's gunners. So that he still respected the chain of command, because ultimately the captain is still the commander of his ship. And that wraps up the first half of this month's Patreon Drydock. See you in the next one.